Tonight, we travel to Tikal, Bedtime, in the late 7th century. In the year 682, a king named Chan Cacao I took the throne of Tikal, a city of limestone and plaster rising from the rainforest of northern Guatemala. His coronation marked the beginning of a second golden age for one of the greatest cities of the Maya world, a place where temple pyramids would soon pierce the canopy above the Bedtime. The dry season had begun, and the white plazas caught the morning light as workers prepared the foundations of what would become Temple I, the king's eventual resting place. Tikal, 734 CE. The first light is touching the limestone crest of Temple I, and you are standing at the edge of the great plaza where the forest meets the city. The humid air carries the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves from the forest floor, and around you the Bedtime rainforest is exhaling the cool of the night into the warmth of the coming day. Howler monkeys call from the canopy edges at first light, their low roars rolling across the treetops like distant thunder that never arrives. You are standing at a harbor of stone and plaster rather than water, a place where the merchant's path from the south finally emerges from the mahogany and ceiba trees to reveal the towering architecture of one of the most significant cities of the classic Maya period. Tikal stretches before you across the cleared ridges, its white temples catching the early sun above the dark green ocean of the canopy. The sound of morning activity rises from the valley floor, wood being chopped, maize being ground, voices carrying across plaster plazas, and you move with it, descending the packed earth slope toward the city's edge. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, their wings flashing emerald against the pale sky. A woman passes you on the path, her back bent beneath a load of firewood bound with sisal cord, her bare feet leaving faint impressions in the damp soil. She does not look up, and you do not speak, for the hour is still too early for the formal greetings that will fill these ways once the sun has fully risen. Tikal, 734 CE. You are walking now between the first structures, low platforms of plastered rubble that serve as the residences of craftsmen and minor officials. The limestone dust has a particular dry, mineral smell where blocks are being dressed, and you pass a workshop where 3 men are shaping a new lintel with stone hammers and hardwood mallets. Their strokes fall in a slow rhythm, each impact releasing a small puff of white powder that settles on their forearms and on the ground around their sandals. The morning mist hangs in the low spaces between temple groups, pooling in the depressions where rainwater gathers and where the city's drainage channels will carry it away before the afternoon heat. The Maya civilization developed from around 1500 BCE from hunter-gatherer cultures, and you can still feel that ancient inheritance in the way the forest presses against every cleared boundary, in the way the cultivated fields of maize and beans give way so quickly to wild growth where the axe has not passed recently. Yet Tikal is no longer a village of thatch and wattle. Urban development here began in the 2nd century CE with temples, stelae, and palace temple complexes, and by the 8th century, the city had grown to cover more ground than any single person could walk in a morning. The Maya civilization featured monumental architecture, writing, and long-distance trade, and all of these are visible here in the stone monuments that record royal genealogies, in the paved causeways that connect the city's districts, in the obsidian blades and jade ornaments that arrive from the highlands to the south and the distant coasts to the west. You emerge from the residential quarter into the great plaza, and the scale of the place opens around you like a held breath released. The plaza stretches empty in the early hour, soon to fill with traders, petitioners, and priests. But for this moment, it belongs to the mist and the birds and the few laborers who move across its white surface with brooms of palm frond. Temple I stands half finished, its summit not yet crowned with the king's mortuary shrine, and the wooden scaffolding clings to its eastern face like a vine that will be stripped away once the final course of masonry is laid. The temple rises 70 meters above the plaza floor, and from its summit priests may have observed celestial events to mark days that governed planting, ceremonies, and possibly military movements. Tikal reached a first peak in the 5th century when a powerful ruling dynasty subdued neighboring small states, and the kings who ordered this temple's construction are believed to be the inheritors of that authority, traditionally described as descendants of the rulers who first carved the jaguar symbol into their banners and their belts. The 5th century expansion created vassal kingdoms and led to prolonged conflict with the rival state of Calakmul, a struggle that shaped the politics of the Maya lowlands for 300 years and more. You can see the memory of that conflict in the defensive earthworks that ring the city's southern approaches, in the warrior images that decorate the stelae along the plaza's edge, in the very height of this temple that speaks of resources gathered from subject territories, and of labor commanded by a will that brooks no equal in the Bedtime. A second peak may have occurred in the 8th century after Calakmul was defeated as a rival, and it is in this possible second flowering that you now stand, in the reign of a king whose name would be spoken by scribes and carved in stone long after his death. As you cross the plaza toward the North Acropolis, the complex of shrines where the royal dead are buried and venerated, you pass between two stelae that record the victories of this dynasty in battles fought a generation before your birth. The glyphs are fresh, the paint still visible in the grooves where the sculptors chisel past, and the figures they depict wear the elaborate headdresses of war, their captives kneeling at their feet with arms bound behind their backs. The scent of wet earth and rotting leaves persists, but here in the plaza's center there is another smell, the smell of copal incense that drifts from the temple doorways where the priests have already begun their morning offerings. Now the harbor is filling, for the city is waking around you in the slow accumulation of purposeful movement. A group of women descends the steps of the central Acropolis, their water jars balanced on their heads, their bare feet finding the familiar paths without need of eyes. Children emerge from low doorways, already at work gathering the night's soil or chasing the dogs from the cooking fires. The sound of morning activity rises louder now, closer, more distinct in its individual components. Tikal, 734 CE. The first settlement traces here date to the early 1st millennium BCE, and the ground beneath your sandals likely holds the accumulation of centuries of human presence, of fires lit and extinguished, of houses built and built again, of the dead buried with their offerings and the living walking above them. You can feel that depth in the way the plaza floor has risen over centuries, in the way the older structures are buried beneath the newer, in the way the very shape of the land has been altered by the weight of human intention. The limestone dust draws you now to the edge of the plaza, where a larger workshop is in operation, a team of 20 men or more preparing the stone for Temple the First's completion. The blocks may have arrived on wooden sledges dragged by teams of workers, possibly pulled along a causeway from quarries to the south, where limestone outcrops provided raw material for the city's construction. The dust coats everything, the men's hair and skin, the leaves of the shrubs that grow against the workshop walls, the very air you breathe as you pass. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, their calls barely audible above the ringing of the hammers. The harbor is the city itself, the place where the forest's abundance is transformed into the stuff of civilization, where the cacao and the cotton and the feathers of the quetzal become the currency of kingship and the markers of rank. You see that trade now in the figures moving along the causeways, the porters with their loads of goods, the merchants with their counting cords and their knowledge of distant markets. The court is empty now, its white lines freshly repainted, its markers waiting for the players who will arrive with the heat of the day. The great plaza stretches empty in the early hour, soon to fill with traders, petitioners, and priests, and you feel the anticipation of that filling, the way the space holds its breath before the exhalation of human presence. Tikal is located in the rainforests of the Bedtime in northern Guatemala, and the forest surrounds everything, presses against everything, claims every unattended surface with its vegetative patience. The city is known for its remarkable step pyramids, and you have seen them now from every angle, from below where they tower against the sky, and from the raised causeways where their profiles merge with the canopy's uneven line. Tikal is one of the best researched Maya cities, though you know nothing of that research, nothing of the centuries that will pass before strangers from across the sea will walk where you walk and wonder at what remains. For you, this is simply the world, the only city you have known, the place where your life unfolds among the temples and the markets and the fields that feed them both. You are hungry, and you follow the smell to the edge of the plaza where food sellers are establishing their places, spreading mats on the plaster, arranging their wares in the patterns that will attract the morning's first customers. A woman offers you a cup of atoll, the warm maize drink that fills the stomach and steadies the hand, and you accept it without speaking, for the transaction is familiar, the coin unneeded, the relationship one of long standing. The drums are wooden, hollowed logs struck with padded beaters, and their sound carries across the city with a clarity that the voice cannot match, penetrating the thickest walls, reaching the fields beyond the urban core where the farmers already bend to their tasks. Tikal, 734 CE. The drums speak the city's name, speak the king's name, speak the names of the gods who sustain the order of days and seasons. The harbour is full now, the plaza alive with the movement of hundreds, then thousands, the density of population that makes Tikal one of the great centres of the Maya world. Maya city-states sometimes reach tens of thousands of inhabitants, and though this city may not reach that maximum, it is nonetheless a place of astonishing complexity, of neighbourhoods and quarters and specialised districts where the craftsmen and the administrators and the priests pursue their separate vocations. The king who will be buried there is not yet dead, is perhaps younger than you are, and the temple's completion will mark the passage of a reign, the transformation of a living man into the ancestor who will intercede for his descendants at the edge of time. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, and you watch them go, their flight taking them toward the reservoir where the water gathers for the dry season, the great artificial lake that sustains the city when the rains fail and the forest creeps closer with its promise of reversion, of return. The Bedtime rainforest surrounds Tikal on every side, and the city is an island in that green sea, a place of order and geometry imposed on the chaotic profusion of tropical growth. The harbour is no longer a metaphor, but the actual place, the reservoir's edge where the water carriers gather, where the canoes from downstream arrive with their loads of fish and riverine clay. The water is still, its surface reflecting the temples and the sky with a fidelity that seems deliberate, as if the city had arranged this mirror to contemplate itself. You kneel at the edge and dip your hand, feeling the coolness against your skin, watching the ripples spread and fade. Tikal's power waned in the early 9th century, and construction ceased, but that waning is unimaginable here, in this morning of 734 CE, with the drums beating and the incense rising and the king's temple climbing toward completion. The city was completely abandoned by the 10th century at the latest, and the forest reclaimed what the builders had wrested from it. But that reclamation is as distant as the stars, as the underworld that waits beneath the earth's thin surface. Tikal, 734 CE. The city's history is layered in the ground beneath your feet, in the stories that are told and retold, in the monuments that preserve the names of kings long dead, and the dates of ceremonies long concluded. You are standing at the harbour, though the dawn is long past, and the harbour is everywhere, in every exchange and every recognition, in the city that exists because people gather, because they trade and worship and build together, because they create the structures that outlast their individual lives and that bind the living to the dead in chains of obligation and memory. The Maya collapse between 800 and 1000 CE likely involved wars, overpopulation, and prolonged droughts. But that collapse is not yet visible, not yet present in the consciousness of those who inhabit this morning. A recovery began after about 150 years, primarily in northern Yucatan, and the Maya people will continue, transformed but persistent, in the centuries and millennia that follow. But Tikal will not recover, will not be rebuilt, will become the province of forest and of the occasional traveler who passes through with wonder and with incomprehension. Spanish conquest from the early 16th century subjected the Maya and led to widespread cultural destruction, and the temples you see now will be buried and forgotten, their names lost, their purposes obscured until the tools of modern inquiry uncover them and attempt their reconstruction. Tikal is one of the best researched Maya cities, but that research belongs to a world unimaginable from here, a world of paper and photography and the mechanical reproduction of presence. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, and you look up to watch them, your neck arching, your eyes following their flight until they disappear beyond the temple summits. The cycle of mist and burning, of condensation and evaporation, marks the city's days with a regularity that complements the human cycles of work and rest, of ceremony and ordinary time. You are standing at the harbor, though the day has advanced, and the harbor has shifted its meaning, become the place of afternoon's pause, of the rest that follows the morning's labor and precedes the evening's renewal. Tikal, 734 CE. The settlement continues, the living and the dead together in the ground that holds them both, the stone that records their names, the air that carries their voices across the centuries of a single day. But the light is softening now. The sun has passed its highest point, and the shadows lengthen across the plaza, the temples casting their geometric darkness on the white plaster where the crowd has thinned to those who remain, who persist in their purposes through the afternoon's decline. You feel the slowing in your own body, in the heaviness of your limbs, in the way the heat seems to press against your skin rather than penetrate it. The Bedtime rainforest surrounds Tikal, and Tikal is in the Bedtime, and the distinction between city and forest begins to blur in the softening light, the edges losing their sharpness, the boundaries becoming suggestions rather than facts. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, their last flights of the day, their return to the roosting trees where they will cluster through the night in feathered warmth. The mist gathers slowly, almost invisibly, until suddenly it is present, the air thickened, the distances shortened, the temples becoming shapes rather than structures, presences rather than constructions. Tikal, 734 CE. The settlement sleeps now, the city dreaming its own deep dream, the forest pressing closer with the patience of centuries, the night extending its protection over all that the day revealed. The great plaza stretches below you, and it is empty now, truly empty, the evening solitude having claimed it from the day's multitude. The white plaster reflects the last light with a faint luminescence, a pale glow that seems to come from within rather than from the sun's last rays. You breathe slowly, feeling the air move in your lungs, feeling the exchange that sustains your life, that connects your body to the atmosphere of this place, this moment, this Tikal where you stand at the edge of evening. The sound comes, distant, rolling across the treetops with the same quality of depth, of resonance that you heard at dawn, but softer now, more integrated into the evening's general texture of sound and silence. Green parrots pass overhead in chattering flocks, but they have passed, have found their roosts, and the sky above is empty of their color, their movement, their life. You are standing at the harbor, and the harbor is the temple, is the plaza, is the city itself dissolving into the darkness that will hold it until the next day's light returns. Tikal, 734 CE. For now, there is only this, the temple's mass against the darkening sky, the forest's edge indistinguishable from the sky itself, the air moving across your face with a coolness that promises the night's deeper coolness, its invitation to rest, to release the day's awareness into the darkness that receives all things, that holds all things, that returns all things to the possibility of beginning again. The stone beneath your feet carries the warmth of a day already half finished, and you are standing upon the upper tier of Temple I, the mortuary monument of Jasor Chan Cacao, completed around 734 CE. Around you, the forest spreads in every direction, a green ocean whose surface ripples with the passage of wind. The height is measured not merely in meters, but in the number of forest strata visible below, each layer a slightly different shade of emerald, from the pale new growth of ceiba saplings to the black-green canopy of mahogany crowns that have stood for 3 centuries. Temple I rises approximately 55 meters above the Great Plaza, and from this elevation the world has been reduced to texture and tone. The vertical world of the temple stares exchanged for the horizontal dreaming of the trees. The sound of stone striking stone echoes from the quarry areas, somewhere beyond the western edge of the city, a rhythmic percussion that has accompanied every hour of daylight for 6 years of construction. You cannot see the quarry from here, but the sound travels cleanly through the humid air, arriving as softened punctuation to the nearer noises of the temple platform. Lime mortar gives off heat as it cures, a faint chemical warmth that rises from the joints between the limestone blocks, and you notice this warmth against your ankles where the new masonry meets the older core of the structure. The masonry at Tikal used limestone blocks with mortar made from burnt lime, a technology borrowed from centuries of experimentation, and the curing process continues for weeks after the blocks are set, a slow transformation of powder and water into the binding substance that will outlast the hands that mixed it. A stoneworker pauses on the stairs of Temple I, looking out over the sea of green canopy, his chisel still in his hand, the wooden handle dark with sweat and the oils of his palms. He has been shaping a corner block for the summit shrine, the final course of masonry before the perishable materials are brought up to complete the sacred enclosure. The summit shrines were made of perishable materials that have not survived, but in this year of 734 CE, the thatch is fresh, and the wooden posts are newly cut, the resin still fragrant when the afternoon sun strikes them. The stoneworker's gaze moves across the canopy, measuring the distance to the horizon, and you follow his eyes to where the green meets a pale sky the color of old bone. The view from the temple top shows only green in every direction, broken by white plaster where the city opens, the bright rectangles of courtyards, and the pale lines of Sabloff catching the light. The Sabloff, those raised causeways connecting Tikal's major architectural groups, appear from this height as threads of chalk laid across a velvet surface. The city's core covered roughly 16 square kilometers, though from above the distinction between city and forest seems arbitrary, the built environment and the wild one interpenetrating in ways that the planners of other cities might find unsettling. Tikal had no permanent surface water source like a river or lake, and this fact has shaped every aspect of its existence, from the chultuns carved into bedrock for storage to the reservoirs that must be maintained against the months when rain refuses to fall. The stoneworker knows this without thinking about it. His body carrying the memory of water, carried in clay, pots up these same stairs, his shoulders remembering the weight of survival, in a place where water must be hoarded like jade. Afternoon thunderstorms build over the canopy, the air growing dense with electricity, and you feel the first shift in pressure against your eardrums, a subtle compression that precedes the visible weather by half an hour. The stoneworker returns to his chisel, his movements unhurried, the stone yielding beneath the blade in thin curls that fall to the platform and are gathered by an apprentice for the lime kilns. Construction required massive organized labor, likely corvée obligations, though the particular arrangements are invisible in the present moment, dissolved into the ordinary rhythm of bodies moving in coordination. The roof comb of Temple, the first, catches the afternoon light, its stucco figures newly painted in this year, the red pigment bright against the pale plaster, the faces of gods and ancestors emerging from the flat surface in high relief. The roof combs atop temples added height and carried sculpted decoration, and from the plaza below this comb would read as a stone crown, a vertical extension of the king's authority into the realm of clouds. You descend a few steps to examine the stucco finishing that coated the exterior surfaces, sometimes painted in red or other colors, and your fingers find the slight irregularity where one day's application met the next, the join invisible to distant sight, but tangible to close inspection. The stucco here is still curing, the lime reacting with the air in a process that will continue for months, the surface growing harder and more resistant with each passing season. Temple pyramids were typically built in stepped platforms with steep stairways, and the profile of Temple the First follows this pattern exactly, each level a smaller rectangle stacked upon the one below, the whole aspiring toward the sky without ever pretending to reach it. Priests climb the steep central stairway for a ceremony at the summit shrine, their white garments visible against the grey stone long before their voices become distinct. The steep stairs require climbing with hands and feet, the limestone worn smooth by countless footsteps, and you watch the priests adapt their gait to the angle, their bodies leaning forward, their hands finding the edges of steps that were not designed for dignified ascent. There are 4 of them, perhaps 5, their numbers difficult to determine as they pass behind the massive central mask that adorns the stairway's base, a representation of the king himself in his role as intercessor between the living and the dead. The mask's plaster eyes follow the climbers, or seem to, the painted pupils fixed upon a middle distance where the human and divine negotiate their perpetual treaty. The orientation of buildings often aligned with astronomical events, and Temple, the First itself, is positioned to mark the passage of the sun across specific days, its shadow falling upon designated points in the plaza below at the solstices and equinoxes. The priests know these alignments, carry them in their bodies as they carry the calendar in their recitations, and the ceremony they now prepare will acknowledge the king's passage into the realm of the ancestors, his transformation from Jasor Chan Keawil I, the living ruler, into Jasor Chan Keawil I, the eternal presence within his mortuary monument. The heat of the curing mortar rises around you as you move to the eastern edge of the platform, where the view encompasses Temple the Second, facing Temple the First across the plaza, built for the king's wife, Lady 12 Macor. The 2 structures create a dialogue across the open space. The male and female principles give an architectural form, the king's temple slightly taller, slightly more massive, but the queen's temple answering with its own perfection of proportion, its own elegance of line. Lady 12 Macor's name survives in the inscriptions, though the woman herself is already becoming legend, her daily existence transmuted into the stuff of dynastic memory, her presence invoked in ceremonies that will continue long after her grandchildren's grandchildren have turned to dust. The North Acropolis at Tikal served as the dynastic burial place for centuries, and from your position you can see its mass structures to the north, a cluster of temples and platforms that have accumulated like coral, each king adding his own monument to the growing complex. The weight of accumulated construction at the North Acropolis created an artificial hill, a geological feature built by human desire rather than tectonic process, and the result is visible even from this distance, a rising of the earth that contradicts the flatness of the surrounding terrain. Priests move there too, you know, though they are too distant to distinguish, their white garments absorbed into the general brightness of plastered surfaces, catching the afternoon light. Workers haul limestone, blocks up earthen ramps that will be removed when construction finishes, and you observe this labor from above, the human figures reduced to the scale of insects, their burden of stone absurdly large against their bodies. The ramps themselves are mountains of packed earth and rubble, temporary structures that consume almost as much effort as the permanent ones they serve. And when Temple the First is complete, these ramps will be dismantled, their material distributed to fill lesser platforms, to level courtyards, to return in some sense to the forest that provided the organic content of their soil. The cycle of building and unbuilding is continuous, the city never finished, always in the process of becoming itself. The lime mortar gives off heat as it cures, a faint chemical warmth that you feel against your palms where you have leaned against a new joint, and this warmth seems to you a kind of breathing, the temple inhaling and exhaling its own slow metabolism. In the lengthening shadows, the white plaster surfaces seem to glow with their own luminescence, artificial stars against the darkening verdure, the view broken by these pale geometries where the city opens. The priests have reached the summit shrine, their voices now audible, a low chant that carries downward on the cooling air, the words indistinct, but the cadence unmistakable, the rhythm of invocation and response that structures all ceremony. This particular comb depicts the king in his apotheoses, rising from the jaws of the underworld to take his place among the celestial bodies, his mortal body translated into eternal stone. The first distant rumble of afternoon thunder arrives as a vibration in the stone, beneath you rather than a sound in your ears, the storm's daily violence approaching to cleanse and nourish and terrify. The priests hurry their ceremony, their voices gaining urgency without losing their measured pace, and you imagine their descent in the coming rain, the stone treacherous, the white garments becoming heavy with water, the boundary between sacred and mundane dissolving in the universal wet. The stoneworker has finished his block or abandoned it for the day, and you find him below on the terrace, gathering his tools into a woven bag, his movements practiced and unthinking. He does not acknowledge you, or perhaps does not see you, his attention turned inward toward the evening meal, the fire, the horizontal rest that awaits. The quarry workers too are finishing, their labor regulated by light rather than clock, by the sun's descent toward the western canopy rather than any abstract division of hours. In the fading light, the North Acropolis silhouette suggests a range of lesser mountains, a distant horizon brought close by the scale of human ambition. Its artificial hill now casts a shadow across the great plaza, the boundary between sun and shade moving visibly as you watch, a slow tide of darkness advancing from the north. Temple II, facing Temple I across the plaza, was built for the king's wife, Lady 12 Macor, and in this light its profile is softened, the edges blurred, the distinction between architecture and atmosphere becoming uncertain, provisional, beautiful in its impermanence. This chemistry continues in darkness as in light, the transformation of materials proceeding according to laws that know nothing of human schedules, human prayers. The stucco finishing coated the exterior surfaces, sometimes painted in red or other colors, and in the last light, the remaining pigment seems to pulse, the color intensifying as the general illumination fades, a paradox of perception that the painters must have understood, must have planned for. Tikal's major architectural groups were connected by raised causeways called Sabloff, and in the dusk these pale lines become luminous, guiding the eye through the darkening landscape, connecting the visible and the invisible, the known and the merely suspected. The city's core covered roughly 16 square kilometers, though the boundaries are uncertain, the inhabited bleeding into the wild, the cultivated into the spontaneous, in ways that resist the cartographer's confidence. The quarry sounds have ceased, replaced by the first calls of nocturnal creatures, the frogs and insects and owls that claim the darkness as their own, that sing the temple to sleep with voices older than any architecture. The roof comb of Temple the First catches no light now, its stucco figures invisible against the sky, their painted eyes seeing nothing, seeing everything, present in a way that does not require visibility. Construction required massive organized labor, likely corvée obligations, and the workers have dispersed to their various barrios, their various hearths, carrying their fatigue as they carry their tools, as possessions to be set down and picked up again with each dawn. The priests have completed their ceremony or abandoned it to the weather, and the summit shrine stands empty, the perishable materials already gathering dew, already beginning their long negotiation with decay. You descend now in darkness, finding each step by memory and touch, the vertical world reasserting its demands, the horizontal of the plaza a promise that recedes with each downward movement. The chemical warmth of curing mortar grows fainter as you move away from the upper levels, the newer construction concentrated above, the older, finished work below. This knowledge accompanies you, a quiet fact among facts, the material basis of the sacred, the literal ground of all that rises toward heaven. In the darkness, the North Acropolis mass is felt rather than seen, a presence against the sky, a gravity that bends attention toward it. Its artificial hill now seems to breathe, to exhale the coolness that moves across your face, that promises the night's deeper coolness, its invitation to rest. From the plaza itself, the height of Temple the First is felt in the neck's extension, the eye's upward movement, the body's acknowledgement of scale rather than any numerical precision. The priests have gone, the stoneworker has gone, the workers with their burdens and their songs and their complaints have gone. You are alone in the space that remains, the temple's mass against the darkening sky, the forest's edge indistinguishable from the sky itself. Now the green and the white and the black are one, the eye defeated by the night, the other senses awakening to compensate. The storm that built over the canopy has passed or not yet arrived, time becoming uncertain in the absence of light, in the presence of so much stone. In the darkness, the roof comb decorations are freed from visibility, released into the realm of imagination, of pure form, of the idea of decoration rather than its particular execution. The stucco colors, too, are liberated, becoming all colors, becoming color itself, the principle of differentiation without the fact. The Sacbiob lead nowhere in darkness, or lead everywhere, their pale surfaces luminous in ways that the day does not reveal, their connection of Tikal's major architectural groups becoming a connection of all points, all destinations, all possible journeys. The city's core covered roughly 16 square kilometers, though in darkness the concept of coverage loses meaning, the city becoming infinite, coterminous with the forest that surrounds and penetrates it. Lady 12 Macor's name persists in the inscriptions, and in the darkness names become important, become almost sufficient, the sound of syllables replacing the sight of forms. What remains is the stone, the lime, the stucco, the architecture of permanence erected around the architecture of passage, the mortal king housed in eternal materials that he might persist, that his name might persist, that Jas or Chan Cacao I might continue to mean, to signify, to structure the world, even in the absence of any who remember his face, his voice, his particular way of moving through a room. The temple pyramids were typically built in stepped platforms with steep stairways, and these stairs now descend into darkness, each step a descent into the less known, the less visible, the more fundamental. You seek the chemical warmth of curing mortar with your hands against the walls, finding the joints by touch, reading the construction with fingers rather than eyes. This reading reveals the skill of long-dead hands, the precision of their fitting, the patience of their smoothing. In the deep, past the sound of stone striking stone echoed from the quarry areas, in the years when this block was shaped, when this joint was filled, when the temple was emerging from the platform below rather than standing complete against the sky. Time compresses in darkness, the then and the now exchanging places, the completed and the becoming indistinguishable. The footsteps of countless climbers persist, impressed in the stone's slight depressions, its polished surfaces, the accumulated passage of bodies moving upward and downward in the service of ceremony, of construction, of the ordinary needs of maintenance and repair. You are standing at the threshold between the temple's mass and the plaza's openness, between the vertical and the horizontal, the built and the natural, the human and the more than human that surrounds and sustains and ultimately reclaims all human effort. The air moves across your face with a coolness that promises the night's deeper coolness, its invitation to rest, to release the day's awareness into the darkness that receives all things, that holds all things, that returns all things to the possibility of beginning again. The view from the temple top persists in memory, in the body's knowledge of elevation, of panorama, of the self diminished and expanded by the assumption of height. The forest's breathing is audible now, the nocturnal transpiration of millions of leaves, the movement of air through branches that have never known the axe, that will outlast the temple as the temple has outlasted its builders, as the builders outlasted their intentions, their names, their particular gods. In this darkness, loss becomes presence, the lost thing becoming more present than the surviving, more real than the merely actual. The centuries of the North Acropolis seem immediate, the accumulated dead present as warmth, as weight, as the slight pressure against the eardrums that indicates a change in weather, a movement of masses in the middle distance. Its artificial hill now seems to grow, to extend, to become indistinguishable from the natural elevations that surround the city, the low ridges and subtle valleys of the Bedtime terrain. The priests climb in darkness now, in other years, in the perpetual present of ceremony that does not distinguish between the particular and the general, the historical and the mythic. The faint chemical warmth of curing mortar persists in the imagination, in the knowledge of processes that continue beneath perception, beneath memory, beneath the threshold of conscious attention. In the darkness, the storm's building is felt as potential, as the accumulation of forces that will discharge, that must discharge, according to laws older than any temple, any dynasty, any human observation. The sound of stone striking stone, the sound of stone striking stone echoes from somewhere beyond the first courtyard, where masons are beginning their work before the sun has fully cleared the eastern tree line. You are standing at the edge of the great plaza at Tikal, and the white plaster stretches before you like a floor prepared for some immense domestic ritual, like the courtyard of a house, expanded to the scale of a city, of a civilization, of an understanding of what public space might mean to people who believed that gods walked among them in human form. The surface beneath your bare feet is cool still, having surrendered the night's accumulated chill only gradually to the dawn air, and the sensation is precise and particular, the coolness of plaster in early morning, a texture somewhere between stone and ceramic, between the natural and the made. Around you, the first figures are emerging from the surrounding structures, moving with the unhurried purpose of those whose labor is governed by rhythms older than any individual preference, any momentary inclination toward rest or hurry. The great plaza was paved with plaster, creating a bright white surface that would grow brighter still as the sun climbed higher. And already you can perceive this gathering luminosity at the horizon's edge, the way the eastern sky seems not merely illuminated, but actively generating light, preparing to pour it across this prepared ground. The plaster surface will hold heat from the sun, radiating warmth into evening, but that transformation belongs to hours yet unlived, to the long arc of this day that is only now beginning its slow traverse across the sky. A woman moves across the white expanse with a bowl balanced against her hip, and the pigment she carries is the color of dried blood, of fresh sacrifice, of the earth itself when certain minerals are ground and mixed with the binding agents that the Maya understood with an intimacy born of generations of experiment and observation. She kneels at a designated point near the center of the plaza, where ceremonies will unfold when the sun reaches its apex, and she begins to spread red pigment on the plaster, the color vivid against the white, a slash of intensity that seems to vibrate with its own frequency, to assert a presence that competes with but does not defeat the surrounding brightness. The pigment sinks slightly into the porous surface, finding purchase in the microscopic irregularities that even the most skilled plasterer's burnishing cannot eliminate, and the mark she makes is deliberate, part of a pattern that will be completed by others, that encodes information you cannot read but can perceive as meaningful, as structured, as belonging to a system of significance that encompasses this entire space. The North Acropolis faces onto the Great Plaza from the north, its mass already casting a long shadow that will shrink toward noon and then expand again, and you can see figures moving on its upper levels, priests or administrators, or those whose roles blur categories that modern separation would insist upon distinguishing. The central Acropolis contained palace complexes for the royal court and nobility, and its architecture speaks of a different relationship to this public ground, one of adjacency and oversight rather than direct confrontation, of watching and being watched, of the complex negotiations between visibility and concealment that characterize all political life, all social organization that exceeds the scale of immediate kinship. Public spaces were hierarchically organized, with restricted areas near royal residences, and you can sense this stratification in the way movement patterns already begin to differentiate, in the way certain figures move freely across the entire expanse, while others follow more constrained paths, their trajectories bounded by understandings that require no visible markers, because they have been internalized through repetition, through the body's own accumulation of permissible and forbidden motions. The sharp white glare at noon, forcing squinted eyes, is still hours distant, but the morning light is already sufficient to make the plaster luminous, to create a quality of reflection that seems to originate from the ground itself rather than merely returning what falls upon it from above. The contrast between white plazas and green forest was striking to approaching visitors, and even now, standing within the space, you can perceive this contrast at the edges of vision, where the cleared ground gives way to vegetation that has been held back but not defeated, that waits with the patience of organic life for any relaxation of human attention, any interruption in the maintenance that keeps this bright surface from being reclaimed. Plaza floors required regular maintenance and resurfacing, and the marks of this ongoing labor are visible in subtle variations of texture and tone, in places where the most recent application has not yet fully cured, where the surface retains a slightly chalky quality that will diminish as the days pass, and the material continues its slow transformation toward greater hardness, greater durability, greater resistance to the feet that will cross and recross it in the months before another layer becomes necessary. Merchants unroll their woven mats at designated spots, arranging cacao beans, jade, and obsidian for trade, and their movements are practiced, economical, the gestures of those who have performed this unfolding countless times, who could execute it in darkness or distraction, who have made of this preparation a kind of meditation, a grounding in the material world that precedes and enables the social transactions that will follow. The jade catches the morning light with a different character than the plaster, a deeper, more saturated quality that seems to hold light within itself rather than merely reflecting it, and the cacao beans release a faint chocolate aroma as they are poured from their containers, a smell that will grow more pronounced as the day warms, that mingles with the other olfactory presences of this marketplace, the copal and the sweat and the faint mineral tang of the plaster itself. The smell of copal incense drifting across open spaces from temple fires reaches you intermittently, carried by air movements that you cannot predict, but can learn to anticipate, the way all inhabitants of this space have learned to read the subtle signs of atmospheric change, of the daily and seasonal transformations that govern life in this tropical latitude. Plazas served as gathering spaces for markets, ceremonies, and political events, and you can perceive this multiplicity of function in the architecture of the space itself, in the way it accommodates without dictating, in the way its blankness becomes a kind of potential, waiting to be activated by the particular assemblies that will occur across the hours of this day and the days that follow. Stelae and altars recorded dynastic history and royal rituals, and you walk toward one such monument, its carved surface dense with glyphs that preserve the memory of accessions and victories, and the proper performance of ceremonies whose details might otherwise have been lost to the erosion of oral transmission, to the mortality of those who held them in living memory. The stone is darker than the plaster, absorbing rather than reflecting the morning light, and the contrast between its substantiality and the surrounding brightness emphasizes its function as a point of fixation, a place where the eye and the mind might rest from the luminous expanse, where information is stored in a form that resists the immediate moment in favor of longer durations, of the centuries that the Maya understood as cycles within cycles, as patterns of repetition and variation that gave meaning to individual events by placing them in relation to larger sequences. The heat is building now, the sun having cleared the horizon's obstruction and begun its work of warming the plaster surface that will retain this energy and release it slowly, creating a microclimate of thermal stability within the larger fluctuations of day and night. You move toward the eastern edge of the plaza, where Temple the First rises in stepped profile against the brightening sky, and the great plaza is flanked by Temple the First on the east and Temple the Second on the west, a symmetrical arrangement that speaks of deliberate planning, of cosmological significance encoded in architectural form, of the way that space becomes a text that can be read by those who possess the proper training, the proper patience, the proper willingness to see meaning in proportion and orientation, and the relationship between built forms and the movements of celestial bodies. The temple's mass creates a zone of shade at its base, and you step into this cooler air, feeling the immediate relief from the growing intensity of direct exposure, the way that the architecture functions not merely as symbol, but as environmental modification, as technology for the management of bodily experience. Courtyards within palace groups were also plastered and sometimes painted, and you can imagine the extension of this bright aesthetic into more intimate spaces, into the domains where royal and noble life unfolded away from the full publicity of the great ceremonial ground, where the same materials and techniques served different social purposes, created different atmospheres of exclusivity and proximity. From your position at the temple's base, you can see the complex roof lines that indicate this residential function, the lower profiles and more intricate plans that distinguish dwelling from temple, private ceremony from public display. The distinction is not absolute, the categories not pure, and the Maya understanding of space and social function likely recognized gradations that your own conceptual vocabulary struggles to capture, that require a suspension of familiar oppositions in favor of more nuanced, more permeable understandings. Children chase each other across the plaza surface, their voices carrying a particular quality of playfulness that transcends cultural specificity, that speaks of bodies finding joy in movement, in the simple fact of being alive in a space that permits and even encourages such expenditure of energy. Their feet patter against the plaster with a rhythm that differs from adult locomotion, quicker and more variable, punctuated by the sudden stops and changes of direction that characterize games whose rules are being invented in the moment, negotiated through gesture and vocalization rather than prior agreement. The plaster surface holds heat from the sun, radiating warmth into evening, and you can see this process beginning as the sun's angle lowers and the direct illumination becomes oblique, as the shadows lengthen and the quality of light shifts from the white intensity of noon toward the golden and then amber tones that precede twilight. The children's play traces paths across this warming ground. Their movements are kind of spontaneous choreography that contrasts with the formal processions that will occupy this same space on ceremonial occasions, that introduces a different register of bodily experience into the accumulated meanings of the plaza. The afternoon is advancing, and the merchants who arranged their goods in the morning are now engaged in the negotiations that will determine the day's economic outcomes. The flows of cacao and jade and obsidian that connect Tikal to broader networks of exchange extending across the Maya lowlands and beyond. The bright white surface now shows the marks of a day's activity, the scuffs and spills and subtle alterations that accumulate in any space of human congregation, that will require the periodic cleaning that maintains the brightness against the gradual encroachment of disorder. Trash and debris accumulated in corners until periodic cleaning, and you can see the beginnings of this process in the sheltered areas where wind and foot traffic deposit organic matter, where the maintenance that preserves the ideal brightness must contend with the inevitable byproducts of human presence, the waste and detritus that no social order entirely eliminates, but only manages, displaces, renders temporarily invisible through the labor of those whose work sustains the appearances of permanence and purity. The plastered surfaces of the Acropolis catch the afternoon light differently than the plaza itself, their vertical orientation creating highlights and shadows that emphasize architectural detail, that make visible the sculptural programs and painted decorations that might be less apparent in direct overhead illumination. Now, as the light becomes more horizontal, the contrast between white plazas and green forest achieves a particular intensity, the forest edge darkening while the built environment retains its luminosity, creating a visual drama that must have shaped the experience of arrival for those who approached Tikal from any direction, who emerged from the enclosing vegetation to find this bright clearing, this architectural assertion of human order against the green proliferation of tropical growth. The smell of copal incense intensifies as the afternoon progresses, the rituals that accompany the sun's descent beginning to activate the spaces of ceremonial function, to charge the atmosphere with olfactory presence that marks the transition from secular to sacred time, from the ordinary commerce of the marketplace to the extraordinary communications between human and divine realms. You move toward the western edge of the plaza, where Temple II provides a counterpart to the eastern mass you occupied earlier, and this symmetrical arrangement frames the space and orients it within a cosmic geography that the Maya elaborated with extraordinary sophistication, that connected the immediate experience of place to the movements of planets and the cycles of the calendar and the mythological narratives that gave these patterns human meaning. The temple's shadow is extending now, reaching across the bright surface toward the center of the plaza, and you can stand at the boundary between illumination and shade, experiencing the thermal transition that marks this edge, the slight cooling that attends even partial shelter from direct solar exposure. A royal procession moves from the central Acropolis toward the North Acropolis, accompanied by musicians, and the sound of drums and flutes reaches you before the visual presence becomes clear. the acoustic environment of the plaza carrying sound with a particular clarity that must have shaped the experience of ceremonial events, that allowed the auditory announcement to proceed and prepare for the visual spectacle. The musicians are playing rhythms of measured complexity, patterns that establish a temporal framework for the movement of the royal party, that coordinate the pace of feet and the swaying of banners, and the measured gestures of attendants into a unified performance of political authority. The procession's origin in the residential complex and its destination at the North Acropolis traces a path that connects the private preparations of power and its public display, the daily life of the court with the formal occasions that transform individual rulers into embodiments of institutional continuity. You step back to allow the procession passage, finding a position near the plaza's edge where your observation will not interfere with the prescribed movements, where you can participate as witness without disrupting the choreography that unfolds according to protocols established across generations of practice and refinement. The musicians pass close enough that you can see the instruments, the wooden drums with their stretched membranes, the clay flutes with their intricate finger holes, the rattles that add a percussive texture to the sustained tones of wind and percussion. The sound seems to occupy the plaza differently than ordinary speech or the calls of commerce, to fill the space with a presence that demands attention without forcing it, that creates a field of auditory experience within which the visual spectacle unfolds with enhanced significance. The royal figure at the procession center moves with a deliberation that communicates weight and importance, each step placed with precision, the body held in a posture that balances accessibility and transcendence, the human and the divine. As the procession approaches the North Acropolis, you can see figures emerging from its doorways, priests or officials who will receive and incorporate this movement into the larger ceremonial sequence that occupies the evening hours, that transforms the plaza from marketplace and playground into theater of state, into the setting for performances that affirm and renew the social order. The proximity of stelae and altars to the procession's path suggests their functional integration, the way that inscribed memory and performed ceremony reinforce each other, the way that stone and body collaborate in the preservation and transmission of meaning across time. The sun has descended to the level of the forest canopy now, and the light is taking on the amber quality that precedes the brief tropical twilight, the rapid transition from day to night that characterizes latitudes near the equator. In this lowering illumination, the marks of maintenance become more apparent, the slight irregularities and color variations that record the history of labor invested in preserving this bright surface against the forces of weather and use and organic growth that constantly threaten to diminish it. The white plaster reflected sunlight, creating visible glare in midday hours, but now the surface glows with a softer luminosity, returning the day's accumulated energy in a gradual release that will continue into the darkness, that will make the plaza perceptible even to night vision, a pale expanse visible against the surrounding forest, a ground for the movements of those who continue their activities after sunset, who navigate by starlight and torch flame, and the body's memory of familiar paths. The musicians have fallen silent as the procession reaches the North Acropolis, their function of auditory announcement completed, and a different quality of sound now emerges, the lower tones of formal speech or chant, the rhythms of ceremonial language that carry their own musicality, their own patterns of stress and intonation that mark them as belonging to a register distinct from ordinary communication. You cannot distinguish the words, but you can perceive the structure, the alternation of solo voice and choral response, the pauses that allow for the assimilation of meaning or the preparation for the next utterance, The way that time is organized into segments of performance and reception that differ from the continuous flow of marketplace negotiation or childhood play. You can see the hierarchical organization of space operating now, as the ceremonial activity concentrates near the Acropolis base, as the plaza's center becomes relatively empty, a space of passage rather than gathering, a ground that connects the zones of more intense activity rather than hosting its own concentration of meaning. The first stars are becoming visible in the eastern sky, and the temperature is dropping with the rapidity that characterizes tropical evenings, the day's accumulated warmth dissipating into the clear air, the plaster surface beginning its gradual surrender of the heat that has made it a zone of comfort and activity across the afternoon hours. The children have departed, called to their evening meals or their domestic responsibilities, and the space they occupied so briefly with their play is returning to a different register of use, to the adult ceremonies and transactions that will continue until full darkness makes movement difficult, until the torches and fires create islands of visibility in a larger obscurity. You can feel the warmth in its final stages, the ground approaching thermal equilibrium with the cooling air, the body's own heat becoming more prominent in the experience of temperature, the boundary between self and environment shifting in response to these material transformations. The royal ceremony at the North Acropolis continues, but you find yourself drawn back toward the center of the plaza, toward the red pigment that the woman applied in the morning, which has now undergone a day's exposure to sun and foot traffic, and the subtle chemical processes of oxidation and interaction with the plaster's alkaline chemistry. The mark is faded, but still visible, a ghost of its morning vividness, a trace that will persist until the next resurfacing, until the next application of fresh plaster that will bury this layer and all its accumulated marks beneath a renewed brightness, a blankness that awaits the inscriptions of subsequent days and seasons and years. The bright white surface is always in process, always becoming, always requiring the maintenance that sustains it against the forces of entropy and organic growth, and the simple accumulation of human use that would otherwise transform it into something else, into a ground that records its history in layers of discoloration, and where, rather than in the deliberate inscriptions of stelae and the temporary markings of ceremony. The darkness is gathering now, the sky above the plaza still holding a last residual brightness at the western horizon where the sun has descended, but the eastern sky already deep toward the blue-black of full night. The smell of copal incense becomes more prominent as the visual world contracts, as olfactory experience expands to fill the attention that vision can no longer occupy with the same density of information. You stand at the approximate center of the plaza, turning slowly to perceive the encircling architecture as silhouettes against the fading sky, the masses of Temple the First and Temple the Second reduced to vertical presences that block starlight, that create zones of greater darkness against the general obscurity. This orientation, so clear in daylight, must now be reconstructed from memory, from the body's internalized knowledge of this space that repeated movement has made as familiar as any domestic interior, any path between sleeping place and water source, and the fields of cultivation that sustain life. The sound of evening insects begins to emerge from the surrounding forest, a continuous tonal presence that will persist through the night, that provides an auditory ground against which other sounds achieve definition. The calls of night birds, the distant percussion of falling fruit, the occasional movements of larger animals at the forest edge. Rain on plaster makes a distinct flat sound, different from rain on leaves, and you find yourself anticipating this possibility, the afternoon's atmospheric conditions having suggested the potential for precipitation. the dense humidity that precedes tropical rainfall still palpable in the cooling air. But the night begins clear, the stars emerging in their full density, the Milky Way a luminous band that arches across the sky above the plaza, that connects the eastern and western horizons in a river of light that the Maya observed and named and incorporated into their understanding of cosmic structure, of the relationship between the patterns above and the events below, between the movements of celestial bodies and the rhythms of human history. You move toward the southern edge of the plaza, where the ball courts at Tikal were located in the southern part of the city center, and the architecture changes in response to this specialized function. The long, narrow form with its sloping side walls, the rings or markers that define the proper conduct of the game that was at once athletic competition and ceremonial reenactment, cosmic drama performed through bodily movement and the manipulation of a rubber sphere that embodied properties of elasticity and resilience that must have seemed to partake of the supernatural of powers beyond ordinary material experience. The ball court's plaster surfaces would have received their own maintenance, their own applications of fresh material to repair the damage of play, the impacts of bodies and balls against the inclined walls, and you can imagine the sounds that would have filled this space during active use, the calls of players, the impact of the solid rubber against plaster, the responses of spectators gathered along the court's length, their attention focused on the movement that encoded mythological narrative in athletic form. The night is fully established now, and the plaza has become a different kind of space, its bright surface visible only as a slightly lighter tone against the surrounding darkness, a ground that exists more in memory and proprioception than in immediate visual perception. From this southern position, you can see the faint glow of torchlight from certain windows or courtyards of the central acropolis, the artificial illumination that extends human activity into the hours when natural light fails, that creates pockets of visibility in the larger darkness. Neither the white of the plaza nor the green of the forest is directly perceptible now, both having surrendered to the uniform obscurity that reduces visual experience to the discrimination of lighter and darker tones, of presence and absence, of the starlit sky, and the star-occluding masses of architecture and vegetation. The sound reaches you first as a subtle alteration in the insect continuum, a faint percussion that might be mistaken for the fall of some heavy fruit or the movement of a large animal, but that gradually organizes itself into the recognizable pattern of rainfall approaching across the forest canopy. You are standing at the edge of the palace reservoir, Tikal, in the month of March, when the dry season in the Bedtime reaches its most severe and unrelenting phase, stretching from November to April across this limestone landscape that holds no permanent rivers, no natural lakes, no flowing water to sustain the estimated population of Tikal, which ranged from 45,000 to over 100,000 at its peak. The reservoir before you lies at its lowest level, the mud cracking at the margins in a pattern of irregular polygons that catch the morning light and cast thin shadows across the exposed basin, and the smell of mud and rotting vegetation at low water rises to meet you, earthy and ancient, the accumulated breath of months without rain. Around you, the central acropolis rises against the pale sky, its plastered walls showing the stains of previous waterlines, the highest marks commemorating seasons of exceptional abundance, the lowest whispering of drought and worry, and the careful rationing of what remained. The particular green of water plants at reservoir edges has retreated to a narrow band along the deepest part of the basin, a diminished fringe of water lilies and other plants that grew in reservoir margins when the water was higher, their roots now exposed and drying in the harsh light, their leaves reduced to a few persistent clusters floating in the last remaining pool. You watch a heron pick its way along this diminished margin, each step deliberate, each pause an act of patient calculation. The bird's reflection fractured by the slight movement of water that still seeps from some hidden spring or slow draining channel. The plaster lining of the reservoir shows here and there where the water has receded, the pale surface cracked and mended across generations of use, for the reservoirs were lined with plaster to reduce seepage, to hold what was captured against the greedy limestone beneath. Archaeologists have found this plaster, have traced its composition, have understood something of the labor required to maintain these basins against the constant pressure of time and weather, and the simple physics of water seeking lower ground. The Palace Reservoir, the largest reservoir, lay near the central Acropolis, and you can see now how this placement was no accident, how the water management was essential for sustaining dense urban population, how every aspect of the city's design bent toward this fundamental necessity of holding rain against the coming drought. An elderly man sits on the reservoir's rim, his back against a fallen stela half buried in leaf litter, and he remembers when the reservoir was dug, the labor of his father's generation, the thousands of baskets of earth carried away on human backs, the shaping of the basin, the careful application of the plaster lining that would make holding possible. He speaks without urgency, his voice matching the pace of the morning, and you hear him describe the first filling, the astonishment of seeing water remain where water had never gathered before, the transformation of this place from a seasonal depression to a reliable source. The temple reservoir sat adjacent to the temple, the fourth complex, he tells you, and the Corriental reservoir served the eastern part of the city, and each was dug in its season, each was lined and maintained, each represented the accumulated will of a population that understood the terms of their settlement, the bargain they had made with this land of seasonal abundance and seasonal absence. The weight of a full water jar, cool against the carrier's back, is a sensation that will not return until the rains come, until the basins fill again, and the daily labor of carrying water eases from its dry season intensity. For now, the women of Tikal must walk further, must reach deeper, must balance their ceramic vessels with greater care as they climb the reservoir's stepped sides and make their way through streets that grow dustier with each passing week. You watch them now, three figures descending to the remaining pool, their movements practiced and efficient, the tilt of their bodies compensating for the uneven ground, the placement of their feet finding the firmest path through the cracked and drying mud. They do not hurry, for haste risks spillage, and in this season every drop must reach its destination, every vessel must arrive as full as it was filled. The end of the dry season brought the greatest water stress, and you can feel that stress in the quiet of the morning, in the way the city seems to hold its breath, in the diminished sound of human activity that matches the diminished sound of water. Even the parrots pass overhead without their usual raucous commentary, as if the atmosphere itself has grown too thin to support unnecessary noise. The archaeological evidence indicates periods of severe drought in the 9th century, evidence that would be gathered centuries later from sediment cores, showing fluctuating water quality and occasional pollution. The record of human pressure on these systems written in the layered deposits at the reservoir bottoms. But this morning, in this moment, the drought is simply the condition of existence, the background against which all other activity must arrange itself. Evening light turns reservoir water to bronze, and you return to the palace reservoir as the sun descends toward the western forest, the sky taking on colors that seem almost extravagant after the muted palette of the dry months. The water that remains catches this light and holds it, becomes a mirror of the burning sky, a small bronze world in the midst of the cracked and dusty basin. The smell of mud and rotting vegetation at low water has softened with the cooling air, has become something almost pleasant, the smell of life persisting, of adaptation, of the tenacious hold that water and its attendant organisms maintain even in diminishment. The sound of frogs beginning to call as rains return is still weeks away, but in the softening of the evening you can almost imagine it, can almost hear the first tentative croaks that will announce the turning of the season. For now there is only the insect continuum, the eternal background hum of the Bedtime night, and the faint rustle of something moving in the leaf litter beyond the reservoir's rim. The elderly man has gone to his house, has left the stella to its slow burial, has carried his memories with him into the gathering darkness. The women with their water jars have reached their destinations, have poured their careful loads into household storage, have begun the evening preparations that water makes possible. The city of Tikal, with its population estimates ranging from 45,000 to over 100,000 at its peak, continues its patient existence, its dependence on these artificial waters, its waiting for the return of rain. You move through the streets as darkness completes itself, the stars emerging in their ancient patterns above the temple summits, the temperature dropping toward its nightly minimum. The reservoirs are invisible now, their presence known only by the subtle depression of the terrain, the slight coolness of the air above their remaining water, the memory of their bronze surfaces held in the mind's eye. The temple reservoir, sitting adjacent to the temple, the fourth complex, exists in this darkness as a possibility, a future reflection, a basin waiting to hold the image of that great structure when the rains return and the water rises. The Corriental Reservoir, serving the eastern part of the city, holds its own diminished pool, its own margin of persistent plants, its own version of the universal story of holding and waiting and hoping. The months pass, as months do, and you are standing again at the Palace Reservoir, Tikal, in the month of June, when the rains have returned in their full intensity, and the dry season in the Bedtime has become memory rather than immediate experience. The transformation is difficult to comprehend, so complete is the change from the cracked and dusty basin you stood beside before. Now the reservoir brims with water, its surface reaching almost to the level of the surrounding plaster rim, the overflow channels running with the excess that cannot be contained, and the sound of this overflow is part of the soundscape now, a continuous liquid music that replaces the silence of drought with the abundance of renewal. The canals and channels directed runoff into storage basins are functioning at capacity, every surface of the city contributing its share of the precious flow, every architectural plan proving its worth in this moment of maximum capture. The rainy season storms fill the basins with a violence that seems almost excessive after the long restraint of the dry months, and you watch the water rise across the hours of a single afternoon, the level climbing visibly as the rain pours down in sheets that reduce visibility to the immediate surroundings. The plaster lining that you saw cracked and exposed in March is now fully submerged again, its protective function restored, its surface hidden beneath the turbid water that still carries the sediment of recent disturbance. Women draw water in ceramic vessels, carrying them balanced on heads back to households, but now the labor is easier, the water closer to the rim, the path less steep and treacherous. You watch a young woman climb the reservoir's side with a full jar, her body adjusting to the weight with practiced grace, the water's surface trembling slightly with each step, but never threatening to spill. She passes another woman descending with an empty vessel, their exchange a brief glance of acknowledgement, a shared understanding of this season's generosity after the previous season's withholding. The reflection of Temple the Fourth in the still water of its adjacent reservoir appears on a morning after the storm has passed, when the air has cleared and the water has settled to perfect calm. You walk to this reservoir in the earliest light, before the day's activity has disturbed the surface, and you find the image waiting for you, The great pyramid doubled in the water below, its height extended by this vertical repetition, its presence made more monumental by this multiplication. Now you understand something of why this proximity mattered, not merely for the practical convenience of water supply, but for this visual effect, this daily ceremony of reflection that must have carried spiritual weight for those who witnessed it. The plaster lining shows here and there through the clear water near the edges, pale against the darker depths, a reminder of the human labor that makes such reflections possible. You kneel at the reservoir's edge and put your hand into the water, feeling the temperature gradient between surface and depth, the slight viscosity of water carrying suspended matter, the life that teems in this medium that has become, for this season, almost extravagantly available. An elderly man, perhaps the same you spoke with in March, perhaps another, sits in the shade of a thatched shelter near the palace reservoir and remembers when the reservoir was dug, the labor of his father's generation. But now his memory is prompted by abundance rather than scarcity, by the visible proof of what that labor accomplished. He watches the water lilies with satisfaction, notes the level of the reservoir against the plaster marks, calculates mentally how long this supply will last, how many dry months it will carry the city through. The water management was essential for sustaining dense urban population, and in this season of fullness, that essentiality is almost forgotten, almost taken for granted, the daily miracle of sufficient water becoming invisible in its very success. But he remembers, he tells you, he remembers the dry years when even these large basins were not enough, when the end of the dry season brought the greatest water stress, and the rationing became severe, and the difficult decisions were made about who would receive water and who would go without. The reservoirs were integrated with the city's architectural planning, and now, in the season of water, you can trace this integration across the urban landscape, can follow the channels that connect the catchment surfaces to the storage basins, can observe the way the plazas and courtyards are shaped to direct flow, the way the building surfaces are finished to shed water efficiently, the way every element of the built environment participates in this collective enterprise of holding rain. The zeolites, porous minerals, were used in some Maya water filtration systems, and you imagine the careful experimentation that led to this discovery, the testing of various materials, the observation of which produced the clearest water, the most palatable supply. This knowledge, like the knowledge of plaster composition, like the knowledge of basin geometry, accumulated across generations, was refined and transmitted, became part of the cultural equipment that made Tikal possible. Sediment cores show fluctuating water quality and occasional pollution, and you understand that this too was part of the story, that the reservoirs were not merely passive recipients of rainwater but active systems that required management, that suffered from the pressure of dense settlement, that recorded in their layered bottoms the evidence of human success and human failure. But this morning, in this season of fullness, such knowledge lies dormant, held in abeyance by the immediate fact of abundant water, the visible proof of the system's present functioning. Evening light turns reservoir water to bronze again, but a different bronze than the dry season bronze, a deeper and more saturated color that speaks of depth and volume rather than the thin film of water over cracked mud. You sit at the edge of the Corriental Reservoir, which served the eastern part of the city, and watch this transformation occur, the surface passing through stages of gold and amber, and finally this rich bronze that seems almost to glow from within. The Temple Reservoir and the Palace Reservoir and the Corriental Reservoir, each of these basins now holds its version of this evening light. Each contributes to the collective experience of a city that has, for this season, sufficient water. You lie on the reservoir's rim, your back against the cool plaster, and listen to this sound merge with the other sounds of evening, the insects resuming their continuum, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, the faint human voices from the nearby settlement. A woman passes on the path below, returning with her evening supply, her figure dark against the last light, her pace unhurried, her jar riding steady on her head. The stars emerge, and with them a slight mist that rises from the water surface, the warm reservoir giving up its moisture to the cooling air. The months continue their turning, and you observe the gradual shift from the intensity of early rainy season to the steadier rhythms of later months, the reservoir levels stabilizing at their maximum, the overflow channels running less frequently, the vegetation at the margins reaching its full growth. The water lilies bloom, white and yellow flowers that open in morning and close in afternoon, their rhythm matching the sun's, their roots anchored in the reservoir bottom, their leaves floating on the surface that holds the sky. The plaster lining shows less frequently as the water remains high, its maintenance deferred to the season of lower water, its protective function continuing unseen beneath the surface. You return to the Temple Reservoir on a morning of exceptional stillness, when the reflection of Temple the Fourth in the still water of its adjacent reservoir achieves a clarity that seems impossible. The stone structure and its watery twin so perfectly matched that the boundary between them becomes uncertain, the sky and its reflection merging at the horizon of the water's surface. You stand at this boundary, your feet at the edge of the plaster lining, and feel the strange vertigo of this doubled world, the sense that the temple continues below as above, that the reservoir holds not merely water, but a version of the entire cosmos, compressed and reflected and made portable. The particular green of water plants at reservoir edges frames this vision, the lily pads creating a natural border that contains and focuses the image, the green a living contrast to the stone's mineral grey. The Corriental Reservoir served the eastern part of the city, and you walk there now, through streets that show the effects of recent rain, the plaster surfaces clean and bright, the drainage channels flowing with clear water. The population estimates for Tikal range from 45,000 to over 100,000 at its peak, and in this season of water one might consider the higher estimates, imagining the city full of people sustained by abundant supplies, the reservoirs serving their function, the system working as designed. But you remember too the dry season morning, the cracked mud, the diminished pool, the smell of mud and rotting vegetation at low water, and you understand that the city's history oscillated between these conditions, that the rainy season's abundance made possible the dry season's survival, that the entire enterprise depended on this storage, this holding against the coming scarcity. The canals and channels directed runoff into storage basins, and you follow one of these now, tracing its path from a higher plaza down through a series of controlled drops, its flow regulated by stone barriers that slow the water and prevent erosion, that spread the flow across the maximum possible area to promote infiltration and reduce turbidity. This filtration was part of the management, part of the accumulated knowledge that made the system sustainable across generations, that allowed the population to reach its peak and maintain itself through cycles of abundance and scarcity. Archaeological evidence indicates periods of severe drought in the 9th century, and as you walk you might consider what this evidence could mean. How sediment cores showing fluctuating water quality might correspond to periods of stress, population pressure on systems that could not expand, and the gradual accumulation of problems that may have overwhelmed the capacity to manage. But this knowledge belongs to a future perspective, to the archaeologists who would excavate and analyze, to the narratives that would be constructed centuries later. In the present moment of the reservoir's fullness, in the season of water and growth, and the sound of frogs beginning to call as rains return, the future crisis is not visible, is not inevitable, is merely one possibility among many, held at bay by the functioning of the system, by the daily labor of maintenance and management, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood the terms of their existence in this landscape without permanent water. Evening light turns reservoir water to bronze once more, and you find yourself at the Palace Reservoir, Tikal, in the month of September, when the rainy season has begun its gradual decline, but the reservoirs remain full, when the stored abundance seems sufficient to carry through whatever dry months may come. Its surface catches this evening light and transforms it, the bronze color seeming to rise from the depths rather than merely reflecting the sky. You sit at the reservoir's edge and let the scene settle around you. The sounds, the smells, the temperature, the particular quality of light that belongs to this hour and this season. The elderly man who remembered when the reservoir was dug, the labor of his father's generation, has passed his memories to others, has contributed to the collective understanding of what these structures mean, what they cost, what they enable. You lie back against the plaster rim and watch the stars emerge, their light doubled in the still water below, the reservoir holding not merely water, but light, not merely light, but the possibility of continued existence, of the city persisting through another cycle, another dry season, another return of rain. The temple reservoir sits adjacent to the temple, the fourth complex, and the Corriental Reservoir serves the eastern part of the city. The dry season wind moves through the upper canopy of the Bedtime forest, and you are standing at the edge of a clearing where a farmer named Balaam has worked, since the first light became visible through the leaves. His calloused hands grip a wooden-handled axe, the stone blade shaped from chert and bound with agave fiber to its haft, and the rhythmic sound of his work carries across the damp morning air as undergrowth falls away from selected saplings and thorny vines. The smell of wood smoke from field clearing drifts already from yesterday's cut, where dried brush and leaf litter have been gathered into patient piles, awaiting the moment of burning. Balaam pauses to observe the sky, reading the color of the eastern horizon for signs of wind that might carry embers beyond the intended bounds of his field. This patch of forest opened with the accumulated knowledge of generations who understood which trees to spare for shade and which to fell for light. Around you, the forest soil, dark and crumbly after rain and full of insect life, releases its stored moisture into the warming air, and the particular sweetness of roasting cacao over a low fire will come later, when another family's harvest reaches the stage of preparation. For now, the scent is of crushed vegetation and disturbed earth, of the fungal richness that rises from rotting stems where the axe has passed. The rustle of maize leaves in dry season wind exists here only as memory and anticipation, for the planting has not yet occurred, the seeds still resting in woven containers in Balaam's raised storage structure, protected from the rodents that move through the forest floor with their own ancient hunger. You feel the humidity gathering against your skin as the sun climbs higher, the forest's respiration becoming more pronounced, the 1,000 green surfaces of leaves releasing vapor into the atmosphere that will later return as rain. Balaam's field, like those of his neighbors in the dispersed settlements surrounding the urban core of Tikal, likely represents a fragment of the broader agricultural landscape that supported the city's population and may have contributed to tribute systems. The fields were cleared from forest, used for several years, then allowed to fallow, this rotation preserving the soil's capacity to nourish the three sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture: maize, beans, and squash. Maize was the staple crop of Maya agriculture, central to diet and cosmology, and its cultivation bound the farmer to the cycles of the gods who had themselves shaped humanity from corn dough in the narratives preserved by priests and mothers alike. Balaam speaks quietly to the field as he works, words that you cannot quite distinguish, an invocation or a greeting or simply the habit of a man who spends his hours in the company of plants and soil, rather than the stone corridors of the city center. The smoke rises in thin columns from the prepared piles, and the dry season burn sends pale smoke skyward in imitation of the temple fires that burn perpetually in the city's ceremonial precinct, though no priest tends this flame. You move through the clearing's margin, where spared trees cast dappled shade over ground still cool from night's retreat, and the particular sweetness of roasting cacao over a low fire comes to your attention from a direction you had not anticipated, carried on air currents that navigate the forest's architecture of trunk and vine and emergent crown. A woman named Ixchel tends cacao seedlings in a nearby forest garden, their broad leaves still tender, and her presence explains the scent that has found you, for she has prepared a small quantity of last season's harvest to test the quality of beans kept in storage through the months of wet season abundance. The cacao tree, Theobroma cacao *, is an evergreen understory tree of tropical rainforests, and Ixchel's seedlings grow in the filtered light that reaches the forest floor, protected from the full assault of tropical sun by the canopy architecture that their mature forms will one day join. The scientific name derives from Greek theos and broma meaning food of the gods, though Ixchel knows nothing of Greek, nothing of the European naturalist who assigned this botanical designation in an age far distant from her own. Yet she understands the reverence encoded in the term through the daily practices of cultivation and preparation that her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother before that. Cacao seeds are oval, somewhat flattened, generally violet or reddish in color, and Ixchel has spread a selection of these on a flat stone near her small cooking fire, the test roast that produces the aroma now threading through the forest air to reach your senses. Fresh cacao beans have a sharp, bitter taste, and Ixchel will not consume these raw seeds, but rather processes them through the transformations that make them valuable, that make them currency, that make them the frothy bitter drink consumed in painted cups by nobles and merchants, and on occasion by farmers themselves when the harvest permits. Beans are fermented to develop aroma and reduce bitterness, a process Ixchel completed weeks ago with this batch, wrapping the pulp-covered seeds in leaves until the heat of natural fermentation had passed through its stages of transformation. Roasting improves flavor and makes shells easier to remove, and the gentle heat of her small fire accomplishes this now, the shells becoming brittle, the interior developing the complex chemistry of flavor that will survive grinding and mixing with water, with maize, with the chili that gives the finished drink its particular fire, beneath its sustaining richness. You observe the methodical patience of her work, the way her fingers test the temperature of each bean before setting it aside to cool, the accumulated knowledge of texture and sound that tells her when the roast has reached its optimal point. The forest gardens maintain diverse plant species, including ramon, avocados, and medicinal plants, and Ixchel's cacao grows among these companions. The ramon tree with its edible seeds providing emergency sustenance when maize stores run low, the avocado with its oily fruit offering nutrients that complement the grain-based diet, the medicinal plants gathered as needed for the ailments that attend life in a world of parasites and wounds and the fevers that come with the rains. Cacao was cultivated in forest clearings with shade protection, and Ixchel's practice honors this requirement, her seedlings placed where mature canopy will moderate the intense equatorial light, where root systems of established trees will not compete too directly for the nutrients that cacao demands. The rustle of maize leaves in dry season wind returns to your attention from Balaam's field, where the first planting has occurred in the ash-enriched soil, the kernels pressed into prepared hills with the companion seeds of bean and squash that will climb and spread and complement the central stalk's growth through the months to come. The three sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture were maize, beans, and squash, and their interdependence in the field mirrors their interdependence in the cooking pot, in the human body, in the stories that explain why no single crop suffices for complete nourishment. You stand at the boundary between field and forest garden, able to observe both Balaam's broader clearing and Ixchel's intimate cultivation, and the smell of wood smoke from field clearing threads through both spaces, a sensory continuity that binds the agricultural landscape into coherence despite its varied practices and products. The season progresses in its measured pace, and you return to observe the field when the maize has grown tall enough to whisper with every movement of air, the rustle of maize leaves in dry season wind, now a constant presence rather than anticipated memory. Balaam's wife, a woman whose name you have learned is Cacao, carries water to the field from the nearest seasonal stream, her jar balanced on her head with the effortless posture of long practice, her steps sure on path she has walked since childhood. The harvest of maize approaches, the ears filling with the soft dough of developing kernels, the silk drying and darkening where it emerges from the protective husks. The particular sweetness of roasting cacao over a low fire reaches you again, and you follow this scent to find Ixchel processing another batch, her techniques unchanged in their essentials though her hands move now with the confidence of repeated success. The tender broad leaves of her original seedlings replaced by the mature gloss of established trees that bear their fruit directly on trunk and branch in the cauliflowerous pattern that cacao shares with certain fig species. The harvest of maize, the ears carried in woven back racks to storage structures, unfolds across the days when the kernels have hardened to their mature density, when the color of the grain declares its readiness through the specific yellow or white or blue-black that marks each variety's heritage. You stand among the workers, the woven back racks visible in every direction, as women and men move between field and settlement, the structures of storage awaiting their burdens with raised floors and thatched roofs that permit air circulation while excluding the moisture that would summon mold. The forest soil, dark and crumbly after rain and full of insect life, has received the fallen leaves and stalks of the harvested crop, the cycle of return already beginning even as the grain departs for human use. The field's fallow period commencing with the first rains that will accelerate decomposition and prepare the ground for future cultivation. The preparation of the daily atoll, maize gruel, over a 3-stone hearth occupies the morning hours in Ixcacor's household, and you observe from the doorway of the low structure she grinds dried kernels on the metate, the stone surface worn concave by generations of similar use. The mano in her hands shaped to fit the curve she has created through patient repetition. The 3 stones of the hearth support the ceramic vessel in which water waits to receive the ground meal, the fire beneath tended with the same attention that Balaam gives to his field, that Ixchel gives to her cacao, the domestic transformation of grain into sustenance, no less demanding than the agricultural transformations that precede it. The atoll thickens gradually, stirred with a wooden paddle carved from a hardwood branch, the mixture requiring constant attention to prevent the scorching that would ruin the labor of grinding and waste the precious grain. The taste of bitter chocolate foam, spiced with chili, comes to you not in Ixcacor's house, but in another structure larger, where a merchant named Balaam has prepared for the arrival of trading partners from the highlands to the south. Trade networks brought cacao from lowland growing areas to highland consumers, and Balaam's position in this exchange depends upon his access to the products of cultivators like Ixchel, his ability to transport and transform and ultimately to measure value in the currency that cacao beans have become. A merchant measures cacao beans for transaction, counting them into a pile on a woven cloth, and you observe this ritual of commerce in the dim interior of Balam's storage room, the beans heaped in ceramic containers visible in the background, their violet and reddish colors muted by the subdued light that enters through the narrow doorway. Balam's fingers move with practiced precision, separating the counted beans from the main store, his voice low as he speaks with the highland trader who has traveled for days to reach this lowland exchange point. The taste of bitter chocolate foam, spiced with chili, exists here as promise rather than immediate experience, the beans in their counted pile requiring further processing before they become drink, before they fulfill the purpose that gives them value beyond their function as currency. You notice the woven cloth beneath the beans, its pattern marking the village of its production, the textile itself, an item of trade that moves in other networks parallel to the cacao exchange. The transaction completes with the transfer of beans and the reciprocal transfer of highland goods, obsidian blades perhaps, or quetzal feathers, or the jade that the lowland peoples value above almost all other materials. Balam records the quantity in his memory, the Maya numerical system with its place value notation and zero concept serving the needs of commerce as it serves the needs of astronomy and the calendar, the long count of years that structures historical understanding, also structuring the accumulation and distribution of goods. Farmers lived in dispersed settlements surrounding the urban core, and Balam's presence in this intermediate zone reflects the economic integration of city and countryside, the flow of products and people that sustains the ceremonial and administrative centers without requiring the cultivators to abandon their fields for concentrated urban residents. The season turns again, and you find yourself at the edge of Balam's field in its fallow phase, the first green shoots of forest regeneration already visible among the standing stalks of the last maize harvest, the cycle of clearing and planting and harvesting and resting continuing its ancient pattern. The rustle of maize leaves in dry season wind has given way to the rustle of pioneer species colonizing disturbed ground, the forest's patient reclamation of space temporarily surrendered to human use. The smell of wood smoke from field clearing comes now from distant clearings, other farmers repeating Balam's labor in other parts of the agricultural landscape, the thin columns of smoke visible above the canopy, where the forest's continuous surface has been interrupted by human need. Ixchel's cacao trees have matured through the intervening years, for time moves differently in narration than in experience, and you observe her now harvesting the ripe pods with the careful cuts that prevent damage to the flowering cushion from which future crops will emerge. Beans are fermented to develop aroma and reduce bitterness, and the pulp-covered seeds rest in their leaf-lined pit, the natural yeasts of the forest performing their work in darkness. Fresh cacao beans have a sharp, bitter taste, and this bitterness will be transformed, but not eliminated, the fundamental character of cacao persisting through all processing to assert itself in the finished drink, the frothy bitter drink consumed as ritual and sustenance and currency. The scientific name Theobroma asterisk derives from Greek theos asterisk and broma asterisk, meaning food of the gods, and the European naturalist who assigned it worked in a distant century. But the reverence that the name encodes exists here in Ixchel's careful practices, in the value that Balam assigns to the processed beans, in the ceremonial consumption that marks important occasions in the lives of nobles and commoners alike. You move through the landscape of cultivation and settlement, the dispersed pattern of residence visible in the spacing of structures, the agricultural fields and forest gardens connecting human presence across the terrain that stretches toward the urban core on its elevated ground. Maya agriculture used slash-and-burn techniques alongside more intensive methods, and the complexity of this agricultural system exceeds the simple category of Swidden cultivation, incorporating raised fields in wetland margins, terrace construction on slopes, the intensive household production of the forest gardens themselves. The taste of bitter chocolate foam, spiced with chili, returns to your experience in the house of a noble named Inish, where the preparation of cacao reaches its most elaborate expression, the foam beaten to peaks of consistency that mark the skill of the preparer, the chili added with precision to achieve the balance of flavors that elite consumption demands. You observe from the corner of the spacious interior the painted ceramics that will contain the finished drink arrayed on a low table, their surfaces bearing the images of gods and ancestors who themselves consumed cacao in the narrative time of myth. You return to observe this fundamental transformation, the grinding and cooking that makes grain edible, that sustains the population of cultivators and craftsmen and merchants who constitute the city's foundation. The rustle of maize, leaves in dry season wind accompanies your movement between these spaces of production and consumption, the sound a constant reminder of the agricultural base upon which all other activity rests, the field's whispered communication with the air that surrounds it. This soil, this living medium, receives the ash of burned clearing, the fallen leaves of forest garden, the occasional deliberate addition of household waste, the accumulated result of human presence in the landscape over generations of occupation. The cacao beans serve as currency in this transaction, and in others, their value standardized by custom and enforced by the political authority that guarantees exchange, the state function of value maintenance as important as its function of tribute extraction. The season of rains approaches its peak, and the forest soil, dark and crumbly after rain and full of insect life, becomes more consistently moist, the dry season crust of surface compaction softened by the water that penetrates to deeper layers, the forest's metabolism accelerating with the availability of moisture. The smell of wood smoke from field clearing diminishes as burning becomes impractical, the wet vegetation refusing to ignite, the farmers turning to other tasks of maintenance and preparation while waiting for the drier conditions that will permit the cycle to resume. The rustle of maize leaves in dry season wind gives way to the heavier movement of rain-saturated foliage, the sound of water passing through the forest's architecture of leaf and branch and trunk, the drip and splash of accumulation and release. You find Ixchel in her forest garden during this wet season, the cacao trees thriving in conditions that approximate the rainforest understory of their evolutionary origin, the shade protection of mature canopy more complete now with the full development of seasonal foliage. For now, the fresh pods yield their pulp to immediate consumption, the sweet tart flavor of the surrounding matrix enjoyed by children and workers as they harvest, the seeds themselves set aside for the processing that will follow. You move through the landscape toward the urban core, the dispersed settlements becoming more frequent as the distance decreases, the agricultural clearings smaller and more intensively managed, the forest gardens giving way to household compounds with their own production of vegetables and medicinals. The woven back racks visible on the paths carry not only grain, but the full range of agricultural product, the city's appetite for variety as insistent as its appetite for volume. You observe this in the house of a craftsman near the city's edge, his meta-terre of finer stone than Cacao's, his hearth more elaborately constructed, but the essential action of grinding and cooking unchanged, the essential product of sustaining gruel the same across the economic range. The taste of bitter chocolate foam, spiced with chili, marks the distinction of elite consumption, the cacao drink prepared in this same household for special occasions, the imported beans measured with care, the preparation entrusted to the most skilled member of the household. The rustle of maize, leaves in dry season wind, reaches even this urban edge. The sound carried from nearby fields where the second planting of the year develops toward harvest, the agricultural cycle continuing its rotation, regardless of the administrative and ceremonial rhythms that structure urban time. The smell of wood smoke from field clearing comes more faintly here, diluted by distance, and by the competing smoke of urban hearths and temple fires, the sensory signature of agricultural labor subsumed in the broader olfactory landscape of concentrated human presence. Painted books. The Scribes of Tikal, the morning light, enters through the narrow doorway of the workshop in Tikal, falling across your hands as you sit among the scribe's tools. You are sitting on a low bench in the cool interior of a palace room where scribes work, away from plaza heat, and the air here carries the smell of fresh bark paper, slightly acrid, mingling with the dry residue of yesterday's pigments. Around you, the implements of the writer's trade lie arranged with the precision of ritual. Brushes of fine hair set in wooden handles, stone palettes worn smooth by generations of grinding, and the small containers of color that transform observation into record. The blue-black of Maya blue pigment, stable and vivid, catches the light from the doorway, a color achieved through the marriage of indigo and palygorskite clay, heated to the threshold of transformation. The scribe whose place you share has already begun his preparations, selecting mineral fragments for the day's work. The dry crunch of pigment being ground on a stone pallet fills the small space with a rhythmic, patient sound, each stroke reducing solid matter to the fine powder that will carry meaning across time. You watch as he adds water in careful measure, working the pigment with a finger until the consistency satisfies his experienced judgment. The colors emerge one by one. The Maya blue that will depict the watery underworld and the celestial realm, the red ochre from iron-rich earth, the yellow from arsenic sulfide handled with knowing care, the black from charred wood or burned pine, the white from crushed limestone. Each substance demands its own preparation, its own understanding of how mineral becomes message. Maya writing was used for almost 2 millennia, a span of continuity that connects the scribe before you to ancestors whose works have crumbled to illegibility or were destroyed by forces he cannot imagine. The script is logosyllabic, with signs functioning as logograms, syllables, or both, a flexibility that allows the written word to echo the full range of spoken utterance. This complexity is what you observe now, as the scribe tests his brush with a few practice strokes, the tip moving through the prepared color with a soft resistance. The sound of a brush tip touching absorbent paper will come later, when the materials achieve their proper union. Mesoamerica was one of few world regions to develop writing independently, and Maya was the only Mesoamerican script capable of fully reproducing spoken language, a distinction that places the scribe's labor among humanity's most remarkable intellectual achievements. The bark paper awaits, folded accordion style in the manner of Maya books, made from the inner bark of fig trees beaten, and prepared until it achieves this particular quality of surface. You feel its slight texture against your fingertips, the way it accepts and holds moisture, the subtle irregularity that speaks of organic origin. The scribe unfolds a section, weighing the corners with polished stones to prevent the material from curling as work proceeds. His posture settles into the concentration that will sustain him through hours of exacting labor, the stillness of the body serving the activity of the mind and hand. The first glyph block takes shape under his brush, each sign precisely proportioned within the invisible grid that governs Maya aesthetic order. Calendar dates were commonly enclosed in rectangular cartouches with rounded corners, and you observe how the scribe reserves space for such elements, his planning visible in the spacing of surrounding signs. Numerals used dots for units and bars for fives, a system elegant in its simplicity, and you notice small numerical notations in the margins where he has calculated the dimensions of his composition. The script is now considered readable and interpretable, though the full nuance of any given text may yield only to sustained scholarly attention, the patient comparison of one inscription against another across the corpus of survival. The morning advances into Tikal, and the light shifting through the doorway traces the passage of time across the workshop floor. The thick masonry walls absorb and delay the day's heat, maintaining the interior's separation from the growing warmth outside. The smell of fresh bark paper, slightly acrid, persists as a foundational note beneath the more assertive presence of mineral pigments. The scribe works in silence, broken only by his breathing and the occasional adjustment of his position, the dry crunch of pigment being ground on a stone pallet, having given way to the softer sounds of application. You are standing now at the edge of the workshop, observing how the completed sections of the book accumulate beside the scribe, each panel a window into the knowledge he preserves. Books were made from bark paper, folded accordion style, and the physical object grows under his hand, a portable repository of what his culture considers worth remembering. The blue-black of Maya blue pigment, stable and vivid, appears in the glyphs that denote watery spaces and divine locations, its chemical stability, a promise of endurance that history would partially fulfill. Writing materials included brushes, pigments of various colors, and prepared surfaces, and you note how each element in this triad receives the scribe's unhurried attention, nothing taken for granted, nothing assumed to be ready before its time. The scene shifts with the afternoon, and you find yourself in a larger chamber where the air moves more freely, though the protected seclusion of the scribble quarters maintains its character. A royal audience is assembling, the Lord of Tikal arriving with the measured pace that announces deliberate purpose. The scribe you observed earlier now appears in different garments, the tools of his trade present not as working implements, but as symbols of his function. Scribes held high status in Maya society, identified by title in texts, and this social elevation is visible in his bearing, in the respect with which others make space for his passage. You are seated among the witnesses as the scribe unrolls a genealogical record, the folded accordion-style book opening to reveal generations of descent, marriage, and political alliance. The sound of a brush tip touching absorbent paper is absent here, replaced by the scribe's voice reading aloud from the painted glyphs, his pronunciation carrying the weight of official recitation. Maya was the only Mesoamerican script capable of fully reproducing spoken language, and this vocal performance demonstrates that capacity, the written signs becoming audible speech in the mouth of the trained reader. The Lord of Tikal listens with the stillness of one whose own position is confirmed by what the text records, his ancestry traced back to the founding figures of legitimate authority. The logosyllabic nature of the script permits the scribe's reading to move between registers with practiced fluency, sometimes pronouncing the full phonetic value of a sign, sometimes offering the more condensed utterance that logographic reading permits. Texts appear on buildings, monuments, murals, ceramics, and jewelry, but this folded book possesses a particular intimacy, its portable format allowing it to travel with the court, to be consulted in diverse settings, to serve as movable testimony to unchanging truth. The afternoon light in Tikal takes on the golden quality that precedes evening, and the audience concludes with the formal acknowledgement of all that has been heard and witnessed. The scribe rolls his genealogical record with the same care he brought to its creation, the painted surface protected by its format, the knowledge it contains secured against the accidents of time. You observe how others depart before he does, how his status manifests in these small privileges of precedence, how the title that identifies him in texts corresponds to the visible respect of those around him. The continuity of Maya writing across nearly 2 millennia is sustained by such performances, the repeated enactment of its social function across generations of practitioners and audiences. Evening comes to Tikal, and you find yourself returned to the workshop, though the labor now differs from the morning's patient preparation. The night work of copying astronomical tables by lamplight occupies the scribe before you, a task demanding the same precision as royal genealogy, but directed toward different knowledge. The flame of the ceramic lamp casts moving shadows across the ceiling of the cool interior, its light supplemented by additional sources until the working surface achieves adequate illumination. The smell of fresh bark paper, slightly acrid, mingles now with the oily residue of lamp fuel, the combined scent distinctive to this nocturnal labor. The astronomical tables unfold across the work surface, their complexity apparent even to your untrained observation. Numerals use dots for units and bars for fives, and you follow the scribe's eye as he verifies each notation against his source, the transfer of information demanding absolute fidelity. The sound of a brush tip touching absorbent paper returns, softer now in the night stillness, each contact a small event in the larger project of reproduction. You observe how he works in longer stretches than during the daylight hours, the absence of visitors and ceremonial obligations, allowing sustained concentration, the rhythm of copy and verification becoming almost meditative in its repetition. Maya writing was forgotten after the conquest and largely deciphered only in the late 20th century, a future rupture unimaginable to the scribe whose hand moves with such confident purpose, whose culture's continuity seems as assured as the celestial cycles he records. The night deepens in Tikal, and the lamp flames require periodic attention, the wicks trimmed, the fuel replenished from stored reserves. The masonry that delayed the day's warmth now releases it gradually, maintaining the comfortable temperature of this protected space. The script is now considered readable and interpretable, and the astronomical precision you witness here would eventually contribute to that decipherment, the eclipse tables and Venus cycles providing known quantities against which glyphic readings could be tested. But such outcomes lie beyond the horizon of the present, beyond the scribe's intention or awareness, his focus entirely on the faithful transmission of established knowledge. Dawn approaches, and the scribe completes a section of his copying, setting aside his brush with the gesture of one who knows the point of diminishing returns, when fatigue threatens accuracy. You follow him as he leaves the workshop, not to rest, but to observe another aspect of writing's materialization in Tikal. The early light finds you both at the edge of the central plaza, where a sculptor has already begun his work on a limestone stela, the text planned to last centuries in a medium more durable than bark paper. The sculptor's implements differ from the scribe's brushes, his mallets and chisels and gravers designed for resistance rather than absorption, yet the glyphic content connects their labors across material difference. You are standing close enough to feel the vibration as hammer strikes chisel, each blow a commitment to permanence, the limestone yielding its surface only gradually to the sculptor's intention. Tikal's stelae combine portrait images with lengthy glyphic texts, and you observe how the composition has been laid out in advance, the figure of the ruler occupying the upper register, the columns of glyphs descending in ordered progression below and beside. The sculptor works from a prepared drawing, the glyph blocks already designed, their proportions established before the first stone was quarried. The same logosyllabic flexibility governs the carved texts, the signs adapted to the constraints of stone without losing their capacity for full linguistic representation. The morning advances, and the sculptor's progress reveals the depth of planning that such monuments demand. The text planned to last centuries requires not merely durable material, but careful technique, each glyph cut with sufficient depth to survive weathering, the interior details preserved against the erosion that time and climate will inflict. You notice how the sculptor alternates between the bold strokes that establish general form and the finer work that differentiates one sign from another, the dot of a numeral, the bar of a 5, the distinctive profile of a logogram. These mathematical elements receive particular attention, their precision essential to the calendrical and astronomical statements that anchor the text in measurable time. The plaza around you fills with the sounds of Tikal awakening to another day, the commerce and ceremony that constitute urban life proceeding in their ordinary courses. Yet the sculptor's focus remains absolute, his chisel moving through the limestone with the same unhurried precision the scribe brought to bark paper, the same commitment to exactitude across different material resistance. Texts appear on buildings, monuments, murals, ceramics, and jewelry, and this stela will join the others that mark Tikal's sacred spaces, creating a landscape of readable memory, a city that speaks to those who know its script. The sun rises higher, and the sculptor pauses to assess his work, running a hand across the carved surface to detect irregularities invisible to distant observation. You perceive the satisfaction in this gesture, the craftsman's knowledge of quality verified through direct sensory contact, the same knowledge that guided the scribe's testing of color consistency, the same knowledge that informed the reader's verification of genealogical claim. The workshop's interior seems distant now, yet connected to this exposed labor by the common thread of glyphic purpose, the shared commitment to preserving meaning against time's depredations. The mineral dust of limestone has replaced the smell of fresh bark paper, the olfactory signature of a different craft serving the same cultural project. The stela will stand for centuries in Tikal, and much of what it records will remain legible long after the bark paper books have succumbed to the climates of tropical preservation and the violence of historical rupture. Only 4 substantial Maya codices survived Spanish destruction, a future catastrophe that no sculptor or scribe of the classic period could anticipate, the vulnerability of their portable books unimagined in an era when Tikal's power seemed eternal. The destruction of Maya books by Spanish missionaries was extensive and deliberate, a systematic effort to eliminate the knowledge system that sustained indigenous religion and social organization, and the folded accordion-style books proved tragically easy to burn, their accumulated wisdom reduced to ash in ceremonial bonfires. The Dresden Codex, Madrid Codex, Paris Codex, and Grolier Codex are the surviving works, and their names betray the geography of their survival, the European collections that preserved what European conquest had attempted to destroy. The labor you have observed in Tikal, the grinding of pigment, the careful painting of glyph blocks, the public recitation, the nocturnal copying, the stone carving, can now be understood with something approaching the comprehension of its original practitioners, the scholarly achievement of decipherment restoring access to a closed past. You remain with the sculptor as morning passes into midday, the stela's text emerging gradually from the prepared stone, the portrait of the ruler gaining definition alongside the glyphic columns that proclaim his titles and deeds. The blue-black of Maya blue pigment, stable and vivid, will not appear here, the polychrome that once enlivened such monuments having faded or flaked from most surviving examples. Yet the carved forms retain their capacity for meaning, even in monochrome survival. The sound of a brush tip touching absorbent paper belongs to the workshop, to the night hours of astronomical copying, not to this plaza of enduring stone. Yet both sounds participate in the same cultural system, the same technology of preserved utterance. The sculptor steps back to evaluate the overall composition, the relationship of image to text, the balance of filled and empty space that governs Maya aesthetic satisfaction. You perceive the integration of elements, the way the ruler's portrait and the glyphic columns constitute a single statement, visual and verbal reinforcement of legitimate authority. The day in Tikal continues around you, the plaza's activity increasing as the morning's cooler hours give way to the bustle of midday commerce and administrative exchange. The sculptor resumes his work, the hammer's rhythm re-establishing itself against the ambient sound of urban life. You find your attention shifting between the immediate labor before you and the broader context it inhabits. The city of Tikal, with its thousands of inhabitants, its temple pyramids and palace complexes, its agricultural sustenance and commercial connection, all of it threaded through with the writing that makes social complexity legible to itself. The span of Maya writing encompasses not merely the recording of information, but the constitution of a world, the creation of a shared reality accessible to those who could read, and through reading, participate in the continuity of cultural memory. The afternoon finds you wandering through Tikal's built environment, observing how texts appear on buildings, monuments, murals, ceramics, and jewelry, the script's presence as various as the social contexts that required its services. On a painted ceramic vessel, you recognize the same glyphic conventions the scribe employed, the same calendrical notations enclosed in rectangular cartouches with rounded corners, the same numerical system, adapted to the curved surface with the flexibility that the logosyllabic principle permits. This adaptability explains its persistence across such diverse applications, its capacity to serve ritual and practical, public and private, permanent and ephemeral purposes. The cool interior of a palace room where scribes work calls you back as the day's heat intensifies, and you return to find the workshop occupied by different hands, the astronomical copyist replaced by another practitioner preparing materials for a different project. The smell of fresh bark paper, slightly acrid, greets your return, the workshop's characteristic atmosphere enveloping you as the plaza's broader sensory complexity falls away. The preparation of this material continues, the supply of writing surfaces demanding constant renewal, the consumption of knowledge production measured in the steady depletion of prepared bark. The evening approaches in Tikal, and you find yourself once more in the presence of the scribe who began your day, his appearance changed by the hours of labor, his concentration perhaps thinned by fatigue, yet still present in his movements. The work you have witnessed would eventually contribute to modern decipherment, the accumulated corpus of inscription providing the comparative material that scholarship required. But such outcomes remain unimagined in the present moment, the scribe's attention directed toward the immediate demands of his craft, the social obligations of his status, the cultural expectations that surround his specialized knowledge. Night falls, and the workshop prepares for the nocturnal labor you observed earlier, the lamps readied, the astronomical tables or genealogical records or ritual prescriptions brought forth for copying or consultation. You remain as witness to this continuation, the rhythms of scribble labor extending beyond the day you have observed into the longer durations that constitute a life in Tikal, a career of service to the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The night deepens, and the lamplight in the workshop creates its own geography of illumination and shadow, the scribe's figure emerging from and receding into darkness with his movements between table and shelf, work surface and reference text. You feel the night's weight now, the long hours of observation settling into a kind of waking dream, the workshop's familiar elements losing their sharp edges in the diminished light. The scribe pauses, his brush lifted from the surface, the moment of inscription suspended between intention and completion. You observe this hesitation, the slight tremor of decision before the brush descends again to leave its trace. Each contact of brush with surface realizes one of the possibilities that the logosyllabic system permits, the scribe's choice informed by context and convention, by the reading he intends his text to receive. The night in Tikal progresses toward its middle, the hours when human capacity for sustained attention reaches its natural limits, when error becomes more probable, when the wisdom of rest asserts itself against the pressure of unfinished work. The scribe acknowledges these limits in his gradual slowing, the intervals between brushstrokes lengthening, the reference to source texts becoming more frequent as memory weakens, the accumulated fatigue of a day that began before dawn making its claim upon his body. You perceive the weight of this accumulated effort, the physical cost of intellectual labor made visible in his movements, the scribe's dedication approaching the threshold where further work would compromise rather than advance the quality of his product. The lamp flames gutter slightly, the fuel approaching exhaustion, and the scribe makes the decision that experience has taught him to recognize, setting aside his brush with finality, covering his prepared colors against the night's humidity, securing his work against the accidents that darkness might bring. The astronomical table or genealogical record or ritual prescription will await the morrow, its completion deferred to the renewed capacity that sleep will restore. The smell of fresh bark paper, slightly acrid, lingers as you prepare to withdraw, the workshop's atmosphere having become familiar through the hours of observation, the sensory signature of a craft that has occupied your attention across the full cycle of a Tikal day. The scribe's final gestures are economical, practiced, the small rituals of closure that mark the boundary between work and rest, between the concentrated attention that inscription demands and the diffuse awareness that sustains ordinary life. You observe how he does not rush, how the unhurried character of his morning preparation extends to this evening conclusion, the same quality of patience governing beginning and end. The night outside holds Tikal in its darkness, the temple pyramids rising as silhouettes against a sky where the Milky Way traces its familiar path, the celestial observations recorded in the astronomical tables now visible above you, the connection between human record and natural cycle made palpable in this moment of shared darkness. The scribe has recorded what he could of these patterns, the predictability that governs lunar eclipse and Venus phase, the temporal infrastructure that organizes ritual and agricultural life. His knowledge will be transmitted, copied, consulted, extended by those who follow. The continuity of scribble practice sustaining the continuity of cultural understanding, until the rupture that history will bring, the conquest and its destruction, the forgetting and eventual recovery. You withdraw from the workshop as the scribe extinguishes the last lamp, the darkness complete for a moment before his eyes adjust, before the starlight from the doorway provides sufficient guidance for his passage to rest. The sound of a brush tip touching absorbent paper has ceased, the soft contact that marked the hours of inscription now replaced by the silence of completion, the stillness that follows sustained labor. The blue-black of Maya blue pigment, stable and vivid, rests in its container, the marriage of indigo and palygorskite clay awaiting the next day's reactivation. The chemical stability that ensures its endurance across time, already proven in the works that survive. The 4 codices that escape destruction, the carved monuments that weathered centuries, the accumulated corpus that would eventually yield to decipherment, restoring voice to a script that once spoke with the confidence you have observed, the confidence of a culture that trusted in the permanence of its records, the value of its knowledge, the continuity of its understanding across the generations that practice and transmission would sustain. The main text will proclaim the infrastructure of accuracy that supports the surface of recorded statement. You are standing in the doorway of that chamber, and the cold of stone temple floors against your bare feet in the hours before dawn sends its gradual recognition upward through your legs, a chill that does not demand movement, but simply exists as information, as the body's knowledge of where it stands in relation to the earth and the hour. The particular clarity of stars when the rainy season ends has begun to manifest in the sky above the courtyard. where the scribe will soon climb to continue his vigil. The moisture that has hung in the air through 6 months of precipitation has settled, has drained through the limestone, has left the atmosphere stripped of its veils, and the light that arrives from distant fires in the heavens now reaches the eye with minimal interruption, with minimal dissipation into haze. You feel this clarity as a quality of the air itself, a thinness that carries sound differently, that allows the voice of the priest-astronomer to travel from the summit of temple, the fourth to the ears of his assistant, below with unusual precision, with unusual penetration through the stillness that has descended over the city of Tikal, over the Bedtime basin, over the limestone shelf that extends in all directions toward the horizon's gradual curve. The Maya calendar was the most developed astronomical calendar of Mesoamerican indigenous peoples, and the men who tended it understood themselves as participants in its operation rather than masters of its structure. The priest-astronomer who now ascends the steep stairway of the temple carries in his memory the accumulated observations of generations, the corrections and refinements that have been transmitted from teacher to student across centuries of deliberate watching. His knee complains on the 14th step, as it has complained for 3 years, and he registers this complaint as he registers all phenomena, as data to be noted and set aside, as the body asserting its presence against the larger task of attention to the sky. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day ritual calendar, possibly adopted from the Olmec, and he recites its current position in a murmur that accompanies his climbing. The number 12 combined with the day name Eb, the deity of the road, the deity of travel, and he smiles at this small correspondence between the calendar's designation and his own present activity of ascent. You are standing at the summit platform now, having followed his path through the darkness, and the sound of wind at temple height, unobstructed by trees, moves across your face with a pressure that is almost constant, almost a feature of the place rather than a passing event. The priest-astronomer positions himself at the eastern edge of the structure, where a sighting device of wood and cord has been erected against the low wall that prevents the unwary from stepping into the void beyond. The first pale light that reveals Venus, low in the east, has not yet arrived. The sky maintains its depth of darkness, its saturation with stars, and the priest waits with the patience that has been cultivated through decades of this practice, this attendance upon celestial events that cannot be hurried, that will occur according to their own pacing, regardless of human anticipation or anxiety. The smoke of copal rises straight up in still air during observation rituals, and you observe the small brazier that the assistant has lit at the platform's center, its contribution to the atmosphere a thin column of resinous fragrance that does not drift, but extends vertically, a marker of the air's absolute stillness, its refusal to move until the sun's heating begins the day's circulation. The priest-astronomer does not look at this smoke, but he knows it is there, as he knows the position of his own body in space, as he knows the date in all the calendars that run simultaneously through his consciousness. Each day in the Tzolk'in combined a number with a named deity, and the combination created a quality of time, a flavor of possibility, that informed every activity undertaken within its influence, every political decision, every agricultural act, every moment of personal significance from birth, through naming, through marriage, through death. The first suggestion of light appears below the eastern horizon, not yet illuminating, but preparing illumination, a thinning of darkness that the experienced eye can distinguish from the general distribution of starlight. The priest-astronomer adjusts his stance, shifts his weight to the left foot, brings his right eye to the sighting device with a motion that has become automatic through repetition, through the accumulated mornings of his 63 years. The Harb was a 365-day civil calendar, running parallel to the Tzolk'in, and the combination of Tzolk'in and Harb dates repeated every 52 years, a cycle of sufficient length to exceed any individual life, but insufficient for the recording of historical events with unique precision, for the establishment of unambiguous chronology across the generations. This limitation had been understood, had been addressed, had been overcome through the development of further systems, further counts, further ways of marking the passage of time so that the position of any day might be known with certainty, might be distinguished from every other day that had ever occurred or would ever occur in the unfolding of the world. You are standing beside the priest astronomer now, and the cold of stone temple floors against your bare feet in the hours before dawn has become something you no longer notice directly, something that has been incorporated into your sense of normalcy, into your body's acceptance of its situation. The priest does not search the sky with his free eye, but maintains his fixed position, his trained attention upon the sector where calculation predicts the emergence, where observation confirms the prediction, where the first appearance of Venus as morning star will mark the completion of approximately 584 days of cycle, the transformation of evening into morning, the reassertion of pattern against the possibility of disorder. The calculation of a royal accession date, combining multiple calendar cycles for auspicious timing, occupies the thoughts of a second priest in a chamber below, a man who has not climbed to the summit, but who works in coordination with the observer above, whose instruments are not sighting devices, but the layered counts of the calendar systems, the interlocking wheels of temporal designation that must align to produce a moment suitable for the transfer of authority. The long count provided unique dates for longer periods, and this priest traces its current position on a strip of bark paper, the series of numbers that locate the present moment in the vast extension of elapsed time since the mythical beginning, since the zero date that serves as foundation for all subsequent measurement. Its maintenance represented one of the highest achievements of Maya intellectual culture, one of the most sophisticated developments of numerical thought in the ancient world, a system that could accommodate millions of years in its forward and backward extension, that could locate any event with the precision of a single day in the unrolling of cosmic duration. You observe the star's emergence as a gradual solidification, a gathering of presence from the threshold of perception into definite existence, and the priest's hand moves to record the moment, to note the accompanying conditions, to preserve this observation for integration into the accumulating body of data from which predictions would be refined, from which the tables of the Dresden Codex would eventually be constructed, the Venus tables for predicting appearances that would guide priests for centuries after this particular morning, this particular watcher, this particular moment of first sighting. Venus was tracked as morning and evening star with a cycle of approximately 584 days, and the precision of this tracking, the reduction of variation to systematic understanding, represented a triumph of sustained observation over the distractions of immediate circumstance, the pressure of political events, the encroachment of mortality upon the individual observer. The column of smoke has shortened now as the brazier consumes its fuel, as the assistant below prepares the descent, the return to the chambers where the night's observations would be transcribed, compared, preserved. The sound of wind at temple height, unobstructed by trees, has begun to shift in character, to acquire the first suggestion of diurnal motion, of the heating that would build through the morning hours and culminate in the zenith passage of the sun, observed and celebrated as the moment of maximum verticality, of the sun's direct standing overhead, when shadows withdrew to nothing and the world existed in a condition of temporary suspension between the extensions of darkness that preceded and would follow. The 365-day year was divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 unlucky days, and the priest-astronomer calculates mentally the position within this structure, the proximity to the period of the 5 days that stood outside the normal order, that carried the quality of danger, of necessary caution, of suspension of ordinary activity. Night watch on the temple roof, the Milky Way visible as the white road across the sky, belongs to a different phase of observation, to the hours when Venus has set, and the attention turns to the broader patterns of the stellar realm, to the great band of light that the Maya knew as Sac-B, the white road, the path of souls and gods traversing the vault of heaven. You are standing at a different hour now, the temporal transition accomplished without explicit announcement, and the particular clarity of stars when the rainy season ends has returned in full measure, the sky restored to its depth and density after the brief interruption of day. The priest-astronomer who occupies the roof platform is not the same man who watched for Venus, or perhaps he is the same man at a different age. The narrative of observation extending across a lifetime, across the succession of generations, across the persistence of the practice itself as the defining activity of the priestly class, the mark of their distinction from those who labored in the fields, who traded in the markets, who carried the burdens of material production, while the astronomers carried the burden of temporal knowledge, of calendrical expertise, of the reading of signs that determined the possibilities of action for the entire social order. The Maya understood the synodic period of Mars, and its wandering brightness, its unpredictable variation in speed and direction, had been charted across centuries of patient watching, incorporated into the growing body of planetary knowledge that distinguished the astronomical tradition of the Maya from that of other Mesoamerican peoples. Jupiter and Saturn were also observed and recorded, their slower motions across the zodiac constituting a different temporal register, a deeper rhythm beneath the more immediate cycles of the sun, the moon, the bright planets that commanded attention through their visibility, their drama, their capacity for variation. The priest who maintains this night watch does not focus upon any single object, but allows his attention to move across the field of the sky, to rest upon each significant point in turn, to gather the overall impression of order and pattern that would inform his report, his interpretation, his contribution to the collective understanding that accumulated in the libraries of the city, in the codices that preserved the distilled experience of generations. You are standing at the edge of the roof, and the cold of stone temple floors against your bare feet in the hours before dawn has been replaced by the different cold of night, air moving across skin, exposed to the sky. The temperature differential that exists between the body and the surrounding atmosphere, between the warmth of metabolism and the chill of cosmic distance. You observe the re-establishment of the copal column, the renewal of the offering as the night progresses toward its most profound depths, toward the hours when the white road stands at its maximum elevation, when its brilliance and extension command the attention even of those who have seen it 10,000 times before. Eclipses were predicted and recorded, considered ominous events, and the memory of the most recent lunar eclipse informs the vigilance of the current watch, the attention to the moon's position and phase, the calculation of the nodes where the paths of sun and moon intersect, where the possibility of shadow exists. The priest-astronomer knows the mechanisms of eclipse prediction with the intimacy of long practice, knows the 173-day period that governs the recurrence of eclipse possibilities, knows the warning signs that precede the actual event by sufficient time to permit preparation, to permit the rituals of response that would address the cosmic disturbance, that would restore the proper relation between the celestial bodies and the terrestrial world that depended upon their ordered progression. The recording of an eclipse in a codex, the darkening sun interpreted as cosmic dialogue, constitutes one of the most dramatic moments of priestly activity, one of the most intense concentrations of interpretive responsibility, as the temporary extinction of light is read as communication from the gods, as message requiring decipherment, as demand for human response in the form of ritual action, of penitential practice, of the reaffirmation of the cosmological commitments that bound the Maya world together in its hierarchical structure. The preparation for a calendar ending ceremony, the completion of a Kayatan period, occupies the daylight hours that follow the night watch, the transition from observation to celebration, from the gathering of information to the deployment of ritual means for marking the passage of significant time. You are standing in the courtyard of the main group at Tikal, and the particular clarity of stars when the rainy season ends has been replaced by the particular clarity of morning light after the storm system's departure, the sky exhibiting a blue of unusual depth, a saturation that seems to extend the quality of celestial observation into the ordinary hours of diurnal activity. The preparation for the Kayatan ending requires the establishment of multiple braziers, the creation of an atmosphere of concentrated fragrance that would mark the space as sacred, as set apart from the ordinary circulation of domestic and political life. The completion of a Kayatan, a period of 200 days, represented a significant juncture in the long count, a moment when the accumulated weight of elapsed time demanded acknowledgement, demanded the construction of monuments, the performance of dances, the offering of sacrifices that would ensure the continuation of the sequence, the renewal of the cosmic order for the period that would follow. Calendar rituals structured agricultural and political life, and the Kayatan ending inscribed this structure at its largest scale, at the level of historical memory rather than daily or annual routine, at the level of the king's obligation to demonstrate his connection to the vast temporal cycles that exceeded individual human duration. You are standing among the preparations, and the cold of stone temple floors against your bare feet in the hours before dawn has been replaced by the warmth of packed earth, of the courtyard surface heated by the advancing sun, by the accumulated radiation of the morning hours. The priest astronomer who had watched for Venus, who had maintained the night vigil, now appears in different vestments, his role transformed from observer to celebrant, from the solitary reader of the sky to the public performer of calendrical knowledge, his expertise displayed in the precision of his movements, in the correctness of his recitations, in the authoritative voice that pronounces the dates, the designations, the coordinates of temporal position that locate this ceremony within the unfolding of the Maya calendar, within the most developed astronomical calendar of Mesoamerican indigenous peoples. The Harb was a 365-day civil calendar, and its position is similarly established. The current month and day noted in relation to the agricultural cycle, to the season of planting or harvest or the preparation of fields, to the practical exigencies that the civil calendar addressed in its more direct relation to the solar year. The combination of Tzolk'in and Harb dates repeated every 52 years, and the priest astronomer, who understands the interlocking of these cycles, who can move between their different registers of meaning, stands as the indispensable mediator between the human community and the temporal order within which it must operate, must find its sustenance, must secure its continuity. You are standing among the assembled observers, and the smoke of copal rises straight up in still air during observation rituals, though the current ceremony generates a more turbulent atmosphere, the movement of many bodies, the disturbance of the air by breath and gesture, and the cumulative heat of congregation, causing the smoke to disperse in patterns that the priest reads with a glance, that he incorporates into his understanding of the ceremony's unfolding, its success or its need for adjustment, for additional offerings, for the modification of procedure that would address whatever signs of dissatisfaction The gods might be communicating through the behavior of the sacred medium. The Maya understood the synodic period of Mars, and the priest knows where Mars stands in its current cycle, knows that its opposition, its maximum brightness, will occur in the coming months, knows that this event will require its own observation, its own recording, its own integration into the accumulating body of astronomical knowledge that the priesthood of Tikal maintains and transmits. You are standing near the place where the codex will be displayed, and the cold of stone temple floors against your bare feet in the hours before dawn has been replaced by the remembered sensation, the body's capacity to retain the impression of past conditions, to summon the quality of earlier hours, even in the warmth of afternoon. The Dresden Codex contains Venus tables for predicting appearances, and the priest astronomer who has consulted this document, who has carried its knowledge in his memory, now recites from its contents, establishes the connection between the current ceremony and the astronomical observations that underlie calendrical practice, that provide the rationale for the elaborate systems of temporal reckoning that the Maya have developed beyond any other people of the region, beyond any other inheritors of the Olmec foundation. The priest-astronomer concludes his recitation, and the ceremony moves toward its closing phases, toward the final offerings and acknowledgements that will complete the ritual marking of the Kayatan ending, that will establish the conditions for the period that follows, that will ensure the continuation of order, of prosperity, of the proper relation between the human and divine realms. Jupiter and Saturn were also observed and recorded, and the priest's final words invoke these slower planets, establish their current positions, connect the immediate celebration to the larger temporal frames within which all human activity must be understood, must be located, must be given its significance. You are standing in the fading light, and the smoke of copal rises straight up in still air during observation rituals, though the current smoke disperses more freely, the evening air beginning to move in patterns that will develop into the full circulation of night. The long count was essential for astronomical calculations and historical records, and the priest-astronomer who has guided this ceremony has demonstrated once more the indispensability of this knowledge, the necessity of the experts who maintain it, the dependence of the entire social order upon their continued vigilance, their continued capacity to read the signs that the heavens provide, to interpret the calendar that governs all meaningful action. The night in Tikal progresses toward its middle once more, the cycle reasserting itself, the hours of darkness returning as they always return, as they have returned since the beginning of the long count, as they will continue to return for the unimaginable duration of its extension. Priest-astronomer who watched for Venus, who maintained the night vigil, who celebrated the Kayatan ending, now rests in his chamber, his body horizontal upon the woven mat, his mind still moving through the calculations, the observations, the responsibilities that will resume with the coming dawn. The last light fades from the summit of Temple the First, its silhouette becoming a darker shape against stars that have begun to emerge in the deepening blue above the Bedtime rainforest. You are standing at the base of the great stairway, and the stone still holds the memory of afternoon warmth against your palm as you rest your hand upon the lowest step. Though the Bedtime rainforest temperature drops noticeably after sunset, with a gradual certainty that the Maya have observed for generations upon generations. The cooling air carries scent of night-blooming flowers from the forest edge, a sweet heaviness that drifts across the reservoir and mingles with the smoke of evening cooking fires that rise from the compounds beyond the ceremonial precinct. The chorus of frogs and insects rises after sunset, beginning with solitary voices that soon find answering calls until the darkness vibrates with layered sound, each species occupying its own register in the auditory architecture of the night. You are standing at the edge of the reservoir, and the water that reflected golden afternoon light now holds only the dimmest suggestion of sky, a darkness so complete that the distinction between liquid and air seems to dissolve at the boundary where frogs call from emergent vegetation. The rustle of bats leaving temple roof crevices in thousands begins overhead, a soft, continuous exhalation as the colony departs for its nocturnal foraging, their forms invisible against the darkening heavens, though their presence is felt in the faint displacement of air across your upturned face. A night watchman makes his rounds along a causeway, torchlight flickering on plastered walls that have been smoothed and painted in the lifetime of Jasor Chan Cacao, whose reign has brought these precincts to their greatest flourishing. You are standing where the causeway meets the edge of the central plaza, and the watchman's approach is audible before his light becomes visible, his sandals scraping the packed limestone surface with a rhythm that speaks of long practice, of a route walked so many times that his feet find their own path through the darkness. The torch he carries is of resinous pine, gathered from the forest that presses against the city's margins, and its smoke carries the clean sharpness of that wood as it passes where you wait in the shadows between buildings. The particular darkness between temple masses surrounds you now, where stars are invisible, where the sky is reduced to narrow strips of lesser blackness between silhouettes of stepped profiles that rise against the heavens. You are standing in this passage, and the walls on either side have cooled to the temperature of the night air, their plastered surfaces smooth beneath your fingertips as you trace the familiar route that priests and nobles have walked for centuries in the city that would survive its great king by less than 2 centuries, though this future is unknown to those who move through tonight's darkness. The Maya night was divided into watch periods, segments of darkness marked by the movement of stars across the sky, and by the changing of guards at posts throughout the urban landscape, and the watchman's passage marks the transition between the first and second of these divisions. In a palace chamber, a noble family settles for sleep on raised platforms, mosquito nets hung from corner posts to create fragile boundaries against the insects that emerge with the darkness. You are standing in the doorway of this chamber, observing the quiet rituals of evening, the murmured words between parents and children, the arrangement of woven mats upon the elevated surfaces that separate sleepers from the coolness of plastered floors. Temple fires and household hearths provided the only artificial light in this world after sunset, and the glow from the family's small fire casts moving shadows across the whitewashed walls, shadows that seem to possess their own intentions as they shift with each breath of flame. The distant roar of a jaguar from the forest beyond the reservoir reaches even here, a sound that causes a momentary stillness in the chamber, a held breath before the routine of evening resumes. You are standing upon this elevated platform, and the darkness below resolves into varying textures of shadow, the deeper blackness of forest canopy against the slightly lighter tones of cleared areas where milpa fields stretch toward the horizon. The forest encroached on cleared areas, requiring constant maintenance, and even in darkness, you sense the patient pressure of vegetation at the margins of human order, the tendrils and roots that advance across boundaries of stone and cultivation. The boundary between the ordered city and wild forest was permeable and meaningful, a threshold crossed daily by hunters and wood-gatherers, and by the spirits that moved more freely than any living foot. The chorus of frogs and insects rises after sunset to its full nocturnal intensity, a soundscape so complete that individual voices are lost in the collective assertion of life that continues while human activity diminishes. You are standing at the edge of a courtyard where a single torch burns in a wall bracket, its flame steady in the absence of wind, and the sound of insects seems to emanate from the very stones, from the plastered surfaces, from the air itself, as a property of darkness in this place. Nocturnal animals include jaguars, ocelots, tapirs, and numerous insects, and while the great cats move silently through territories that extend beyond human settlement, their presence is announced in other ways, in the sudden cessation of smaller sounds, in the alarm calls of birds roused from roosts, in the tracks found at dawn's light where none were visible before. You are standing upon the upper terrace of a residential complex, and the stars have shifted their positions since you first looked upward, the great tree of the sky having rotated around its northern anchor as the hours pass through their measured progression. The Maya cosmos included an underworld, surface world, and upper world, and the night sky above you represents the uppermost of these realms, the place of ancestors and gods, and of the celestial bodies that move with purposes beyond human comprehension. The ceiba tree connected the levels of the cosmos, its roots descending to the underworld, its trunk occupying the surface world of human habitation, its branches reaching toward the heavens where you now direct your gaze. The particular darkness between temple masses offers a different perspective when you enter it again, the narrow passage seeming to compress sound as well as light, the insect chorus becoming more distant though no less persistent. You are standing in this confinement of shadow, and your hand finds the carved edge of a door jamb, the limestone worn smooth by generations of touch in the darkness of this same passage. Caves and cenotes served as passages to the underworld, vertical connections between the levels of existence that the Maya understood as simultaneously separate and continuous. And while this corridor is merely architectural, its darkness suggests something of that other passage, that descent into realms where light was rare and meaning was transformed. Night was associated with danger, spirits, and transformation, and the atmosphere of the city after dark carries this awareness in its very textures, in the quality of sounds that seem closer or more distant than daylight would confirm, in the shapes that resolve and dissolve at the edges of vision. You are standing at the entrance to a temple sanctuary where a priest maintains a temple fire through the hours of darkness, feeding it with resinous pine that burns with a steady illumination and a fragrance that seems to clarify the air itself. The priest's movements are slow and deliberate, each gesture part of a practice maintained across uncounted nights, and the fire he tends is one of several that burn in the ceremonial precinct, each maintained by its own guardian against the possibility of darkness complete. You are standing at a junction where two causeways meet, and the watchman's torch is visible again in the distance, its flame reduced to a point of orange that seems to float independently of any bearer, a wandering star at human height. The city was largely quiet after dark, except for guard patrols and ritual activities, and the silence between these movements is itself a presence, a quality of stillness that accumulates in the spaces between sounds until it seems almost tangible, almost weighty upon the skin and in the lungs. The chorus of frogs and insects rises after sunset in waves of intensity, the collective voice ebbing and flowing with rhythms that the Maya have observed and incorporated into their understanding of night's progression. You are standing beside the reservoir where the distant roar of a jaguar from the forest beyond the reservoir was heard earlier, and the water's surface is now completely dark, a mirror that reflects only the absence of light, the presence of depth without visible boundary. The long count date 9, 15, 0, 0, 0 fell in 731 CE during Jasor Chan Cacao's reign, a Kayat unending that was celebrated with ceremonies of dedication and renewal, and the structures that surround you bear the marks of that era, the inscriptions that record that completion still visible upon their surfaces when daylight returns. You are standing now upon the summit of a low platform that overlooks the northern precincts, and the darkness has achieved its maximum depth, the hours of greatest blackness that precede the gradual return of light. The king's ancestors were consulted in night rituals, their guidance sought through dreams and through the interpretation of signs that appeared in darkness. And the priests who conducted these communications moved through the same passages you have walked, stood upon the same terraces, breathed the same cooling air that carries scent of night-blooming flowers from the forest edge. The particular darkness between temple masses begins to yield as you enter it once more, the eastern sky showing the faintest suggestion of color that is not merely starlight reflected from atmospheric haze. You are standing in this passage, and the silhouettes that have been absolute against the sky now reveal subtle gradations, edges where darkness becomes slightly less complete, where the forms of carved masks and roof combs begin to emerge from their nighttime dissolution. The first bird calls before true dawn, anticipating morning, begin as single notes that seem experimental, tentative, before finding confidence in the approaching light, before joining into the chorus that will mark the transition between night's domain and the return of solar presence. You are standing at the eastern edge of the great plaza, and the sky above Temple the First shows the first true color, a deep blue that is no longer the blue of night, but the promise of day, the preliminary to the gold and rose that will follow. The chorus of frogs and insects rises after sunset each evening and diminishes before dawn with a predictability that the Maya have incorporated into their understanding of time's passage, into the watches of the night that divide darkness into manageable segments, into the rituals that acknowledge and seek to influence the transformations that occur while humans sleep. You are standing where the causeway extends toward the forest, and the watchman's torch has been extinguished, his watch completed, his footsteps retreated to some place of rest before the day's labors resume. The particular darkness between temple masses has dissolved into ordinary shadow now, the forms of architecture emerging with their familiar geometries as the light strengthens across the eastern horizon. You are standing in the plaza where the great king's monuments have defined the ceremonial landscape, and the abandonment was gradual, with some areas depopulated before others, though this future is not present in the dawn you observe, in the city that still holds its population, its rituals, its king whose reign has brought these precincts to their greatest flourishing. The first bird calls before true dawn, anticipating morning, have multiplied into full chorus now, the individual voices forming the collective announcement that night has completed its passage, that the watch periods have concluded, that the guardians of darkness may rest, and new guardians assume their posts in the light. You are standing at the base of Temple the First, where the last light faded from its summit, what seems now like a different era, though it was only the hours of a single night, the hours during which you moved through the city's darkness, observed its nocturnal life, stood in its passages, and upon its platforms as the cooling air carried scent of night-blooming flowers from the forest edge, and the chorus of frogs and insects rose after sunset, and the rustle of bats leaving temple roof crevices in thousands marked the transition from day to night. The particular darkness between temple masses, where stars were invisible, has given way to morning shadow that still holds something of night's quality, a lingering coolness in the stone that will persist until the sun climbs higher, until the Bedtime rainforest temperature rises with the day's progression. You are standing in the plaza, and the city around you is beginning to stir, the sounds of human activity resuming after the diminished hours of darkness, the smoke of rekindled fires rising from compounds where families emerge to begin their morning routines. The ceiba tree connected the levels of the cosmos, and somewhere in the forest beyond the reservoir, a great ceiba stands with its buttressed roots extending into the underworld, its trunk rising through the surface world, its branches spreading toward the upper world where the sun now climbs, where the stars still faintly persist in the brightening blue. You are standing at the reservoir's edge, where the water now reflects the true sky, the blue of morning with scattered clouds that hold the first gold of sunrise, and the surface shows ripples where fish rise to feed, where the night's frogs have retreated to their hiding places to wait through the hours of light. You are standing here, and the city that would survive its great king by less than 2 centuries stretches around you with its temples and its causeways and its palace compounds, its population moving through another day that will culminate in another dusk, another night, another cycle of watch periods and temple fires, and the rustle of bats leaving temple roof crevices in thousands. You are standing in the plaza as the light strengthens, and the night's experiences settle into memory, into the understanding of what the city becomes when darkness falls, when the boundary between the ordered city and wild forest becomes less visible, more permeable, more meaningful in its very uncertainty.